In 1940, the world watched in awe as three nations separated by thousands of kilometers, by entire oceans, by radically different cultures, signed a pact that would change the course of history forever. Germany, Italy, and Japan sealed an alliance that promised to divide the planet. But behind the diplomatic smiles, behind the handshakes in front of the cameras, behind the grandiloquent speeches about camaraderie and shared destiny, there was hidden a contradiction so deep, so disturbing that even the most experienced historians continue debating it to this day. Because Adolf Hitler, the architect of the most extreme racial ideology that has ever existed, the leader who proclaimed the absolute superiority of the Aryan race over all others, decided to ally himself with a people who, according to his own theories, should be considered inferior. How is it possible? What led this dictator obsessed with racial purity to strengthen ties with an Asian nation? Did Hitler actually admire the Japanese, as some documents and testimonies of the era suggest, or did he secretly despise them while using them as pawns on his geopolitical chessboard? The answer to these questions will lead us through a labyrinth of contradictions, hypocrisy, political pragmatism, and secrets that for decades remained hidden in classified archives. Before you settle in, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments from where you are listening to us and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. What you are about to discover will completely change your perception of the Axis alliances and the true nature of Hitler's thinking toward his supposed allies on the other side of the world. To understand the complex relationship between Hitler and Japan, we must go back in time, long before the Second World War broke out, long before even the Nazi Party came to power. We must travel to the formative years of Adolf Hitler, when he was just a frustrated youth in Vienna, absorbing like a sponge the racist and nationalist ideas that floated in the atmosphere of early 20th century Europe. At that time, theories about racial hierarchies were in fashion in European intellectual circles. There was talk of superior and inferior races with the same naturalness with which we discuss the weather today. And among these theories, there was a very clear classification. European peoples, especially the Germanic and Nordic ones, occupied the top of the civilizational pyramid, while Asian, African peoples and other non-European groups were considered inherently inferior in intellectual capacity, creativity, and cultural potential. Hitler absorbed these ideas with veracity. He integrated them into his vision of the world. He turned them into the foundation of his ideology. And when he wrote Mein Kampf, his autobiographical and political manifesto, he left his opinions on the different races of the world captured with a chilling clarity. In that book, Hitler established a crucial distinction that would be fundamental to understanding his subsequent relationship with Japan. He divided humanity into three categories: culture creators, culture bearers, and culture destroyers. According to his twisted logic, only the Aryan race was capable of creating original culture, of generating genuine scientific, artistic, and philosophical advances. The other races, in the best of cases, could be culture bearers. That is, they could adopt and transmit the achievements of the Aryans, but they would never be capable of creating something truly new by themselves. And where did Hitler place the Japanese in this classification? The answer is more nuanced than many believe. In Mein Kampf, Hitler recognized that Japan had achieved impressive development in recent decades. The country of the rising sun had gone from being an isolated feudal nation to becoming an industrial and military power capable of defeating Russia in 1905, an achievement that astonished the entire world. But Hitler attributed this development not to the intrinsic creativity of the Japanese people, but to their capacity to imitate and adopt Western technology and methods. In other words, he considered the Japanese as culture bearers, capable of absorbing and applying the advances of the Aryans, but incapable of generating genuine innovation on their own. He wrote that if Aryan influence were to disappear from Japan, the country would inevitably regress to its previous state in a matter of decades. This vision, apparently contemptuous, contained nevertheless an implicit recognition. Hitler admitted that the Japanese were different from other non-European peoples. He granted them a special status, an intermediate position in his racial hierarchy. He did not consider them at the same level as the Slavs, whom he deeply despised, nor much less at the level of the Jews or African people, whom he placed at the very bottom of his scale. The Japanese occupied an ambiguous place, a racial limbo that would allow for justifications and reinterpretations according to the political needs of the moment. But the words written in Mein Kampf in the mid-20s were only the beginning. The true test of Hitler's attitudes toward Japan would come when geopolitical circumstances forced Germany and Japan to consider an alliance. And here is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because we will see how ideological convictions clashed with political pragmatism, how racial theories had to be adapted, reinterpreted, and, in some cases, simply ignored to serve the strategic interests of the Reich. What did the Japanese think of all this? Did they know that their supposed ally considered them inferior according to his own ideology? And how did the most orthodox Nazis react to the contradiction of allying with a race that, according to their own theories, should be despised? The answers to these questions reveal an institutionalized hypocrisy that operated at the highest levels of the Nazi government. Let us advance in the chronology. We are in 1933. Hitler has just become Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party controls the country and begins to implement its radical program. Racial laws are enacted, the persecution of the Jews intensifies, and Germany prepares to rearm in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. In this context, German foreign policy seeks allies who share its hostility toward the established international order. And Japan, which also felt marginalized by the Western powers, which had also left the League of Nations, which also pursued an expansionist policy in Asia, appeared as a natural candidate for an alliance. But here, an uncomfortable question arises that the Nazi ideologues had to confront: how to justify an alliance with an Asian nation when the official ideology proclaimed the superiority of the Aryan race over all others. The solution they found was as creative as it was cynical. The Japanese would be elevated to the status of honorary Aryans. This designation, which sounds almost absurd when analyzed from a rational perspective, allowed the Nazis to keep their racial doctrine intact while collaborating closely with a racially incompatible ally. The Japanese were not Aryans, of course, but they would be treated as if they were, at least for practical and diplomatic purposes. The formalization of this alliance began with the Anti-Comintern Pact, signed on the 25th of November, 1936. Officially, the pact was an agreement between Germany and Japan to oppose the Communist International, that is, the Soviet Union, and its global influence. But behind this anti-communist facade was hidden something deeper: the mutual recognition of two revisionist powers seeking to challenge the existing world order. Italy would join the pact a year later, completing the Axis Triangle. The Japanese foreign minister who negotiated this pact, Arita Hachiro, traveled to Berlin for the signing ceremonies. Photographs of the time show Japanese diplomats being received with all the honors of Nazi protocol. Flags of the rising sun flew alongside swastikas. Speeches were exchanged about the friendship between the two nations, about their common destiny, about the shared fight against Bolshevism. But what was Hitler really thinking when he shook the hands of these representatives of a race that, according to his own ideology, was inferior? The testimonies of those who were close to Hitler during these years offer revealing clues. Albert Speer, the Führer's favorite architect and later Minister of Armaments, related in his memoirs that Hitler expressed contradictory opinions about the Japanese depending on the context and the moment. In public, he praised their discipline, their warrior spirit, their loyalty to the emperor. In private, he sometimes made derogatory comments about their physical appearance, about their short stature, about their facial features. This duality was characteristic of Hitler's personality and reflected the irreconcilable tension between his racial ideology and his political needs. A particularly revealing moment occurred during the private conversations Hitler held with his inner circle, known as the Tischgespräche, or table talk. These informal chats were recorded by several of his collaborators, including Heinrich Heym and Henry Picker, providing us with a unique window into the dictator's uncensored thoughts. In one of these conversations, dated the 20th of February 1942, Hitler reflected on the nature of the alliance with Japan in a way that would surprise those who imagined that a genuine camaraderie existed between the two regimes. Hitler admitted that the alliance with Japan was fundamentally a matter of strategic convenience. Japan was useful because it kept the British and the Americans busy in the Pacific, preventing them from concentrating all their resources against Germany. It was useful because it had proven capable of inflicting humiliating defeats on the Western powers, destroying the myth of white man invincibility in Asia. It was useful because it shared common enemies, but Hitler also expressed concern about the future. What would happen after the war? What would happen when there were no longer common enemies to fight? Hitler feared that a victorious Japan, emboldened by its conquests, could eventually turn against European interests in Asia. This underlying distrust manifested itself in subtle but significant ways. Despite being nominal allies, Germany and Japan never coordinated their military strategies effectively. There was no joint command comparable to the one that united the Western Allies. Strategic information was shared in a limited and selective manner. Each power pursued its own objectives with minimal consideration for the interests of the other. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, Germany was informed only hours before, without any prior consultation on the implications of dragging the United States into the war. Hitler, according to testimonies, received the news with mixed feelings: enthusiasm to see the United States humiliated, but also concern about the long-term consequences. Why did Hitler declare war on the United States just 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor? This decision, which many historians consider one of his gravest errors, has been the subject of intense debate. Some argue that Hitler was fulfilling the obligations of the Tripartite Pact signed in September 1940. But the reality is more complex. The pact only obligated the parties to assist each other if they were attacked, not if they initiated hostilities. Japan had been the aggressor at Pearl Harbor, so technically Germany was not obligated to declare war on the United States. The most probable explanation is that Hitler saw an opportunity in Pearl Harbor. He had been frustrated for months by the growing American aid to Great Britain through the Lend-Lease program. American warships were already escorting British convoys in the Atlantic, and several incidents had almost led to an open conflict. Hitler calculated that war with the United States was inevitable and that it was better to anticipate while the Americans were distracted in the Pacific. He also wanted to show solidarity with Japan, hoping that in return the Japanese would attack the Soviet Union from the east, relieving pressure on the Eastern Front where the Wehrmacht was fighting the Red Army. But the Japanese never attacked the Soviet Union. Despite repeated German pressure, the Tokyo government decided to maintain the neutrality pact it had signed with Moscow in April 1941. This decision would deeply frustrate Hitler and reveal the limits of the Axis alliance. The Japanese pursued their own strategic interests, which pointed towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific, not towards Siberia. The idea of a coordinated assault against the Soviet Union from the west and the east, which would have been potentially devastating for Stalin, never materialized. This lack of strategic coordination raises a fundamental question. Was the Axis really an alliance or simply a temporal coincidence of interests? The evidence suggests the latter. Germany, Italy, and Japan were united by their common opposition to the existing international order, by their resentment toward the powers that dominated the world, by their expansionist ambitions. But they were not united by a shared vision of the future, by a common ideology, or by a coordinated strategy. Each one fought its own war, hoping that the other's successes would weaken their shared enemies. In the specific case of Germany and Japan, geographical distance made any direct military cooperation practically impossible. Attempts to transfer technology and resources between the two nations faced enormous logistical obstacles. German submarines trying to take materials to Japan had to cross half the world, bypassing enemy fleets and air patrols. Only a few managed to complete the journey. Similarly, Japanese planes carrying diplomats and technical experts had to perform risky flights through hostile territories. One of the most curious episodes of this limited cooperation was the mission of the German submarine U-234 in May 1945. This submarine departed from Norway bound for Japan, carrying an extraordinary cargo: blueprints of the latest German fighter planes, radar technology, components for V-2 rockets, and something even more significant, 560 kilograms of uranium oxide. Some historians have speculated that this uranium was destined for the Japanese nuclear program, although this theory remains controversial. The U-234 never reached its destination. When the news of the German surrender reached the submarine in the middle of the Atlantic, its commander decided to surrender to American forces instead of continuing toward Japan. On board the U-234 were also traveling two Japanese officers, Hideo Tomonaga and Genzo Shoji. When the submarine surrendered, these officers found themselves before a terrible choice. They could surrender along with the German crew, or they could follow the code of conduct they had been taught since childhood. They chose the latter. They locked themselves in their cabins and took their own lives by swallowing cyanide pills. Their bodies were buried at sea with military honors by the German crew, a gesture of respect that transcends the racial differences that Nazi ideology proclaimed. This incident illustrates one of the most notable paradoxes of the German-Japanese alliance. At an individual level, many soldiers and officers from both sides developed a genuine respect for their counterparts. Luftwaffe pilots training Japanese aviators, engineers collaborating on technological projects, diplomats working together in embassies. All these personal contacts generated ties that contradicted official racial theories. The propaganda of both regimes tried to foster this spirit of camaraderie, producing films, posters, and publications that celebrated the alliance between the two warrior peoples. A notable example of this propaganda was the German-Japanese film titled Die Tochter des Samurai, The Daughter of the Samurai, released in 1937. Directed by Arnold Fanck with the collaboration of Japanese filmmaker Mansaku Itami, the film told the story of a young Japanese woman educated in Germany who returns to her homeland to marry a Japanese peasant. The message was clear. Despite cultural differences, there existed a spiritual affinity between Germans and Japanese, a mutual respect based on shared values like sacrifice, discipline, and loyalty to the nation. The film was a considerable success in both countries and contributed to creating a positive image of the alliance among the general public. But behind these public manifestations of friendship, racial tensions persisted. Internal Nazi government documents reveal continuous debates on how exactly to classify the Japanese within the Reich's racial system. The Nuremberg laws of 1935, which defined who could be considered a German citizen based on racial criteria, did not specifically mention the Japanese. This created ambiguities that Nazi bureaucrats had to resolve on a case-by-case basis. In 1936, the German Ministry of the Interior issued a secret directive establishing that Japanese citizens residing in Germany should be treated with the same respect as citizens of other friendly nations. They were not to be subject to racial discrimination or the restrictions imposed on other non-Aryan groups. Marriages between Germans and Japanese, although not encouraged, would be tolerated under special circumstances. This directive represented an extraordinary exception to the racial logic of the Nazi regime, an exception that could only be justified by political and diplomatic considerations. The Japanese embassy in Berlin became a privileged observatory for analyzing these contradictions. Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima, who held the post in two separate periods between 1938 and 1945, developed an extraordinarily close relationship with Hitler and other Nazi leaders. Oshima was a career military man, a former military attaché who shared many of the authoritarian and expansionist attitudes of the Nazi regime. He was also an enthusiastic admirer of Germany, who had spent years studying its army and its culture. The conversations between Oshima and Hitler were extensive and frequent. The Japanese ambassador was one of the few foreign diplomats who enjoyed regular access to the Führer. His reports to Tokyo, intercepted and decrypted by American intelligence services thanks to the project known as MAGIC, provide an invaluable source of information about Hitler's thinking and German plans. Ironically, these reports, sent by an ally of Germany, became one of the best intelligence sources the Allies possessed regarding Nazi intentions. What did these reports reveal about Hitler's attitude toward Japan? In his conversations with Oshima, Hitler was consistently complimentary toward Japanese achievements. He praised the Japanese victory over Russia in 1905 as a demonstration of the potential of a well-organized and disciplined nation. He admired the speed with which Japan had adopted Western technology and used it to build an empire. He expressed respect for the Japanese warriors' code of conduct, for their readiness for sacrifice, for their absolute loyalty to the emperor. But these praises must be interpreted with caution. Hitler was a master of manipulation and knew exactly what to say to each interlocutor to get what he wanted. His kind words toward Japan in the presence of the Japanese ambassador did not necessarily reflect his true opinions. In fact, there are testimonies suggesting that in private, when Oshima was not present, Hitler expressed very different opinions. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister and one of Hitler's closest confidants, left an extensive diary that has been the subject of intense study by historians. In several entries, Goebbels records comments from Hitler about Japan that reveal a more complex and ambivalent attitude than public statements suggested. In an entry from February 1942, for example, Goebbels notes that Hitler expressed doubts about Japan's capacity to maintain its conquests in the long term. The Führer thought that the Japanese had advanced too quickly, that they had stretched their supply lines beyond what was prudent, and that they would eventually face problems they would not be able to resolve. In another entry, Goebbels records a conversation in which Hitler reflected on the future of Asia after the war. The Führer expressed his concern that a victorious Japan could become a threat to European interests in the region. He specifically mentioned the Dutch, British, and French colonies that Japan was conquering, and wondered what would happen to these territories if the Axis won the war. Would Japan return them to its European allies or keep them for itself? Hitler seemed to lean toward the second possibility, which would mean a permanent loss of European influence in Asia. These reflections reveal that, despite formal alliances and declarations of friendship, Hitler saw the relationship with Japan in fundamentally pragmatic and competitive terms. Japan was useful while fighting common enemies, but in a post-war scenario, Japan could become a rival. The Axis alliance, in this sense, was an alliance of convenience, not a union based on shared values or a common vision of the future. The attitude of other Nazi leaders toward Japan varied considerably. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, was particularly ambivalent. On one hand, Himmler was fascinated by certain aspects of Japanese culture, especially by the samurai code and by the mystical traditions of feudal Japan. He saw parallels between the Japanese warrior spirit and the ethos he tried to instill in his SS troops. On the other hand, Himmler was also one of the most fanatically committed Nazis to racial ideology. The idea of considering Asians as equals, or even as honorary Aryans, was deeply uncomfortable for him. The SSS archives contain documents revealing Himmler's efforts to reconcile this contradiction. In several memorandums, Himmler explored theories that tried to explain Japanese achievements within the framework of Nazi racial ideology. One of these theories suggested that the Japanese aristocratic class, including the imperial family, was descended from ancient Aryan peoples who had migrated east in prehistoric times. This Aryan elite would have conquered the native Asian population and established Japanese civilization, transmitting its genetic superiority through the generations. According to this theory, Japan's achievements did not contradict Nazi racial ideology but confirmed it. They were the result of the Aryan blood flowing through the veins of the Japanese elite. This theory, of course, lacked any scientific foundation. It was an ideological construction designed to justify a politically necessary alliance. But the fact that Himmler and other Nazi leaders took the trouble to elaborate such justifications demonstrates how problematic the alliance with Japan was from an ideological point of view. If the Japanese had been simply accepted as valuable allies without further consideration, it would not have been necessary to invent theories about occult Aryan origins. Another revealing aspect of the German-Japanese relationship was the way in which both regimes handled mixed marriages. In Germany, racial laws imposed strict restrictions on marriages between Aryans and non-Aryans. But what happened when a German citizen wanted to marry a Japanese citizen? Documents from the era show that these cases were handled with considerable flexibility, at least in comparison with the absolute restrictions imposed on marriages with Jews or with the other groups considered racially unacceptable. A particularly interesting case was that of the filmmaker Arnold Fanck, the same one who had directed the German-Japanese propaganda film mentioned earlier. Fanck maintained a romantic relationship with a Japanese actress during the filming of Die Tochter des Samurai. Although the relationship did not culminate in marriage, the fact that a prominent German citizen could openly maintain a relationship with a Japanese woman without facing legal or severe social consequences demonstrates the special status the Japanese enjoyed within the Nazi racial system. In Japan, the situation was somewhat different. Although the Japanese regime also promoted ideologies of racial superiority, its approach was less systematic than that of the Nazis. The Japanese considered themselves the leading race of Asia, destined to liberate the continent from Western colonialism and to establish a new order under their leadership. But this ideology did not translate into racial laws comparable to those of Nuremberg. German citizens in Japan did not face official discrimination based on their ethnic origin. However, there existed cultural tensions that sometimes emerged in unexpected ways. Germans living and working in Japan during the war often complained that the Japanese did not treat them as true equals. Despite official alliances and speeches of friendship, many Japanese saw Westerners, including Germans, as fundamentally foreigners, as outsiders who could never truly understand the Japanese spirit. This attitude was especially frustrating for the more ideological Nazis, who believed they deserved preferential treatment by virtue of their supposed racial superiority. Japanese communities in Germany also experienced this ambivalence from the other side. Although the Japanese were officially honorary Aryans and were exempt from most racial restrictions, they could not completely escape the climate of racism that permeated German society under Nazism. Some testimonies from Japanese who lived in Germany during this period describe experiences of subtle discrimination, suspicious looks, derogatory comments, a general sensation of not completely belonging despite official guarantees. A particularly delicate aspect of the German-Japanese relationship was the question of the treatment of prisoners of war. Both Germany and Japan were known for their brutality toward prisoners of war, especially toward those they considered racially inferior. The Germans treated Soviet prisoners with extreme cruelty, letting millions of them die of hunger and disease. The Japanese were infamous for their mistreatment of British, American, Australian, and other nationality prisoners in the camps of Asia. But how did the Germans treat Japanese prisoners and vice versa? The answer is that, due to the geographical circumstances of the war, these situations were extremely rare. Germany and Japan fought in completely separate theatres, with different enemies, and there were very few opportunities for soldiers of one country to capture citizens of the other. The few documented cases of Germans in Japanese hands or vice versa generally involved civilians or non-combatant personnel and were handled through diplomatic channels with relative courtesy. An exceptional case was that of the German sailors from the battleship Graf Spee, who took refuge in Argentina after the Battle of the River Plate in December 1939. Some of these sailors were eventually interned by Argentine authorities who were trying to maintain a complicated neutrality. The Japanese government, through its embassy in Buenos Aires, intervened on several occasions to assist these German sailors, providing them with material aid and advocating for their release before the Argentine authorities. This gesture of solidarity was widely publicized by the propaganda of both countries as an example of friendship between the Axis nations. But behind these public gestures of camaraderie, tensions persisted. One area of constant friction was Germany's racial policy toward other Asian groups. While the Japanese enjoyed a special status, other Asian peoples did not share the same luck. The Chinese in particular were viewed with distrust by the Nazi regime, in part due to its alliance with the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, which for years had received German military aid. But even after Germany broke relations with China to strengthen its alliance with Japan, Chinese citizens in Germany continued to be treated as racially inferior. This selective discrimination created uncomfortable situations for Japanese diplomats. Japan was fighting a brutal war against China and certainly felt no sympathy for the Chinese enemy. But at the same time, the way Germany treated non-Japanese Asians sent a disturbing message about the true Nazi attitude toward non-European races. If Germany could discriminate so openly against the Chinese, what guarantee did the Japanese have that they would continue being treated as equals if circumstances changed? Diplomatic documents of the time reveal that the Japanese government was fully aware of these tensions. In several confidential dispatches, Japanese diplomats expressed their concern about the long-term implications of the alliance with Nazi Germany. They recognized that the alliance was necessary to counteract the Western powers, but they also warned that Germany was not a reliable ally and that its racial theories represented a potential threat to all non-European peoples, including the Japanese. This mutual distrust manifested itself in a particularly acute way in the question of the Jews. The Nazi policy of persecution and extermination of the Jews posed complex dilemmas for Japan. On one hand, Japan did not share the visceral anti-Semitism of the Nazis. Japanese cultural tradition did not include the religious and social roots of European anti-Semitism. Jews were a small and little-known group in Japan, and there existed no historical animosity toward them comparable to that which existed in Europe. On the other hand, Japan was allied with Nazi Germany, and a certain ideological solidarity was expected among Axis partners. How would Japan handle this tension? The answer was surprisingly pragmatic. Japan adopted a policy of calculated neutrality toward the Jews, rejecting German pressure to implement anti-Semitic measures while avoiding openly antagonizing its ally. A particularly illustrative episode of this policy was the case of Chiun Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Kaunas, Lithuania, at the beginning of the war. In 1940, thousands of Jewish refugees desperate to escape Nazi-occupied Europe crowded before the Japanese consulate requesting transit visas. Sugihara, disobeying the instructions of his government, issued thousands of visas that allowed these Jews to escape through the Soviet Union and Japan towards safe destinations. It is estimated that Sugihara's actions saved between 6,000 and 10,000 Jewish lives. When Sugihara returned to Japan after the war, he was discreetly dismissed from the diplomatic service, but his disobedience was never severely punished, and the Japanese government did not actively cooperate with Nazi demands to hand over the Jewish refugees who had reached Japanese territory. This policy of passive resistance to Nazi anti-Semitism demonstrates that, despite the formal alliance, Japan maintained a considerable independence in ideological matters. The Jewish community of Shanghai offers another example of this complexity. Shanghai, under Japanese occupation, became an improbable refuge for thousands of European Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Unlike other cities, Shanghai did not require a visa for entry, making it one of the few accessible destinations for Jewish refugees. The Japanese, although they controlled the city, did not impose the lethal restrictions that the Nazis would have demanded. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." That way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics and also help with the video's engagement, okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube continues recommending our videos to you. In 1942, Gestapo Colonel Josef Meisinger, known as the Butcher of Warsaw for his brutality and the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto, traveled to Shanghai with a plan to exterminate the city's Jews. Meisinger proposed several options to the Japanese authorities: deporting the Jews to labor camps where they would die of exhaustion, sending them on ships with no destination where they would die of starvation, or simply executing them. The Japanese authorities rejected all these proposals. Instead, they established a ghetto in the Hongqiu district where the Jews were confined but not exterminated. Conditions in the ghetto were difficult, but the vast majority of Shanghai's Jews survived the war. Why did Japan refuse to cooperate with the Nazi final solution? The explanations are multiple and probably complementary. Some historians emphasize pragmatic reasons. Japan needed to maintain commercial relations with the United States as long as possible, and many American Jews had economic influence. Others highlight cultural differences. Anti-Semitism simply did not resonate in Japanese culture in the same way as in Europe. And some point to Japanese national pride. Accepting Meisinger's demands would have meant subordinating Japanese policy to German dictates, something Japanese leaders were not willing to do. Whatever the explanation, this episode reveals the profound differences that existed between Axis partners despite their formal alliance. Germany and Japan did not share the same ideology, did not pursue the same objectives, and were not willing to sacrifice their national interests for the sake of the other. The Axis alliance was, in the end, a marriage of convenience that concealed profound distrusts and fundamentally incompatible worldviews. Let us return to the central question we posed at the start of this journey. Did Hitler actually admire the Japanese, or did he despise them? The evidence we have examined suggests that the answer is not simple. Hitler admired certain aspects of the Japanese character, their discipline, their warrior spirit, their readiness for sacrifice. He recognized Japan's impressive achievements in recent decades and valued its utility as an ally against common enemies. But at the same time, Hitler never completely abandoned his belief in the superiority of the Aryan race. He considered the Japanese as culture bearers, not as creators. He saw them as useful allies in the present, but as possible rivals in the future. This ambivalence was reflected in the Nazi regime's policies toward Japan. The Japanese were treated with respect and deference when circumstances required it, but there was always an underlying reservation, a suspicion that the alliance was temporary and conditional. The Nazis invented absurd theories about Aryan origins of the Japanese elite to justify collaboration, which demonstrates how uncomfortable the alliance was from an ideological perspective. And when the interests of Germany and Japan diverged, as in the question of the attack on the Soviet Union from the east, each country prioritized its own objectives without consideration for the other. The Japanese perspective was equally complex. Japanese leaders valued the alliance with Germany as a counterweight to the Western powers, but they never completely swallowed Nazi racial ideology. They knew that, according to the theories Hitler proclaimed publicly, they themselves should be considered inferior. They accepted the status of honorary Aryans as a convenient fiction, but not as a truth they actually believed in. And they maintained their independence in matters such as the policy toward the Jews, demonstrating that the alliance had clear limits. Ultimately, the relationship between Hitler and Japan is a fascinating case study on the tensions between ideology and pragmatism in international politics. Hitler was a fanatical ideologue who believed fervently in Aryan racial superiority, but he was also an astute politician who understood that circumstances sometimes required compromises with principles. The alliance with Japan was one of those compromises. A necessary collaboration with a racially incompatible partner, justified by the need to confront more immediate and dangerous enemies. This tension between ideology and pragmatism was not exclusive to the relationship with Japan. It manifested also in other areas of Nazi policy. Non-Germanic collaborators in Eastern Europe, volunteers of other nationalities who fought in the Waffen-SS, minor allies like Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, all these cases posed similar dilemmas. How could a regime based on German racial superiority collaborate with peoples who, according to its own ideology, were inferior? The answer was always the same, through convenient fictions, ad hoc exceptions, and a pragmatism that contradicted proclaimed principles. But there is something special in the case of Japan that distinguishes it from these other examples. Japan was not a minor collaborator nor a dependent satellite. It was a great power with its own imperial ambitions, with its own ideology of racial superiority, with its own vision of the world order. The alliance between Germany and Japan was an alliance between equals, or at least between partners who saw themselves as equals. This made it more significant but also more fragile. Imagine for a moment an alternative scenario. What would have happened if the Axis had won the war? Would the alliances between Germany, Italy, and Japan have survived victory? The evidence suggests not. Once common enemies were eliminated, the latent tensions between Axis partners would probably have exploded into open conflict. Germany and Japan had incompatible visions of the future of Asia. Italy had ambitions in the Mediterranean and in Africa that clashed with German interests. The new Axis world order would have been inherently unstable, plagued by rivalries and distrusts. Hitler himself seemed to anticipate this scenario. In several of his private conversations, he expressed the expectation that the World War would eventually be followed by a war between races, a final confrontation between the Aryan world and the Asian world. In this apocalyptic vision, Japan was not a permanent ally but a potential rival whose rise had to be managed carefully. The current alliance was a tactic, not a long-term strategy. The Japanese, for their part, also had their own reservations about the future of the alliance. Many Japanese leaders saw European powers, including Germany, as colonizers whose dominion over Asia eventually had to end. Japanese rhetoric about the liberation of Asia from Western colonialism had uncomfortable implications for European interests in the region. If Japan triumphed in its war against the United States and Great Britain, would it return the Dutch, French, and British colonies to its European allies? The most probable answer was no. This divergence of interests in the long term was present from the beginning of the alliance, but was carefully hidden by diplomatic rhetoric and propaganda. Both regimes needed the alliance to confront their immediate enemies, so they had strong incentives to minimize tensions and emphasize points of agreement. But behind the facades of friendship, strategic planners on both sides calculated post-war scenarios with a coldness that contradicted public declarations of eternal camaraderie. The Second World War ended differently than any of the Axis partners had anticipated. Germany was defeated and occupied by the Allied powers in May 1945. Japan resisted a few months more until the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific War precipitated the surrender in August of that same year. The dreams of thousand-year empires vanished in ashes. But the questions we posed at the beginning of this analysis continue to be relevant. What does the relationship between Hitler and Japan teach us about the nature of international alliances? What does it tell us about the capacity of ideologies to adapt to political circumstances? What does it reveal about the tensions between principles and pragmatism in the conduct of states? The alliance between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was, in many senses, an alliance of convenience between partners who needed each other but who fundamentally distrusted one another. It was based on shared interests, not shared values. It was sustained by ideological fictions, not by genuine affinities. and it would have collapsed inevitably if it had reached its declared objectives. This lesson has relevance far beyond the specific context of the Second World War. International alliances often unite partners with very different worldviews, united temporarily by common enemies or interests. These alliances can be effective in the short term, but rarely survive the disappearance of the circumstances that created them. History is full of examples of war allies who became peace rivals, of comrades in arms who ended up facing each other. In the case of Germany and Japan, defeat prevented these latent tensions from manifesting fully. But the signs of what could have happened were present throughout the entire war. Distrusts, rivalries, incompatible visions, all were there, waiting for the moment when circumstances would allow for their open expression. And so we reach the end of this first segment of our analysis. We have explored the origins of the relationship between Hitler and Japan, the ideological tensions that accompanied it, the efforts to reconcile the political alliance with Nazi racial theories, and the signs of mutual distrust that were hidden behind the facades of friendship. We have seen how Hitler admired certain aspects of the Japanese character, while simultaneously considering them racially inferior according to his own theories. We have examined how the Nazis invented the fiction of honorary Aryans to justify an ideologically uncomfortable alliance. And we have reflected on what this story teaches us about the nature of international alliances and the relationship between ideology and pragmatism in world politics. But this story has many more chapters to tell. How did the relationship between Germany and Japan evolve throughout the war? What impact did the alliance have on the military strategies of both countries? How did the German and Japanese people respond to calls for solidarity with an ally so distant and different? And what legacy did this alliance leave in the relations between Germany and Japan in the post-war era? Let us now delve into the crucial years of the war, when decisions made in Berlin and Tokyo would determine the fate of millions of people. We will explore the moments of greatest closeness between the two allies, but also the episodes of friction and disagreement. We will examine the key personalities who molded the relationship, from diplomats and generals to ideologues and propagandists, and we will analyze how the changing circumstances of the war affected the dynamics between the Axis partners. Let's begin with an episode that perfectly illustrates the complexities of the alliance: the German reaction to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. On the 7th of December 1941, Japanese planes attacked the American naval base in Hawaii, destroying a large part of the Pacific Fleet and killing more than 2,400 American military personnel and civilians. The surprise attack was a spectacular tactical success for Japan, but it was also a decision that would fundamentally change the course of the war by bringing the United States into the conflict. When news of the attack reached Berlin, the initial reaction was euphoria. Hitler, according to the testimonies of those who were with him, struck the table with his fist and exclaimed that Germany had never lost a war when it had such powerful allies. He felt vindicated in his decision to ally with Japan and confident that the entry of the United States into the war would not alter the final result. After all, he reasoned, the United States would have to divide its forces between two oceans, fighting simultaneously against Germany in the Atlantic and against Japan in the Pacific. But behind this initial euphoria were deeper concerns. Hitler had not been informed in advance about Japanese plans. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise both for Germany and the United States. This lack of coordination was symptomatic of the weaknesses of the Axis alliance. Germany and Japan were nominally allies, but they operated in an almost completely independent manner, without sharing strategic plans or coordinating their actions. More concerning still was the question of long-term implications. Hitler had hoped that Japan would attack the Soviet Union, not the United States. A Japanese offensive against Siberia would have enormously relieved pressure on the Eastern Front, where the German army was bogged down in a brutal war against the Red Army. Instead, Japan had chosen to expand toward the south, conquering European colonies in Southeast Asia and facing off against the United States and Great Britain. This decision reflected Japanese national interests, not those of Germany. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor continues to be one of the most debated enigmas of the Second World War. Technically, the Tripartite Pact did not obligate Germany to declare war on the United States in these circumstances. The pact promised mutual assistance if one of the signers was attacked, but Japan had been the aggressor at Pearl Harbor, not the victim. Hitler could have maintained the fiction of neutrality with the United States, at least formally, while waiting to see how events unfolded. Then, why did Hitler declare war? Historians have proposed several explanations. Some emphasize strategic considerations. Hitler believed that war with the United States was inevitable and preferred to take the initiative instead of waiting. Others highlight accumulated frustrations. Incidents in the Atlantic between American warships and German submarines had created a situation of undeclared war that Hitler wanted to resolve once and for all. And some suggest more personal motivations. Hitler despised Roosevelt, whom he saw as a puppet of Jewish interests, and the declaration of war was a way to openly challenge the American leader. But there is also a dimension related to the alliance with Japan. By declaring war on the United States, Hitler demonstrated solidarity with his Asian ally. He hoped that this gesture would be reciprocated with a Japanese attack against the Soviet Union. This hope, however, never materialized. Japan maintained its neutrality pact with Moscow during the entire war, concentrating its forces in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The strategic coordination that Hitler imagined never existed. German frustration with this lack of coordination manifested repeatedly in the following years. On several occasions, German diplomats pressured their Japanese counterparts to consider an attack against the Soviet Union. They argued that an offensive from the east would divide Soviet forces and facilitate German victory in Europe. But the Japanese had their own reasons to resist these pressures. In the first place, Japan had suffered a significant defeat against the Red Army at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. This battle, little known in the West, was a confrontation between Japanese and Soviet forces on the border between Mongolia and Manchuria. The Soviet commander, Georgy Zhukov, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Japanese, demonstrating the capacity of the Red Army and convincing many Japanese leaders that a war against the Soviet Union would be extremely costly. In the second place, Japan's resources were already stretched to the maximum by the war in China, which had been ongoing since 1937, and by the new campaigns in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Opening a third front against the Soviet Union would have been strategic madness, especially considering that Japan lacked the oil, steel, and other resources necessary to sustain a prolonged war against such a formidable enemy. In the third place, Japanese strategic interests pointed toward the south, not toward the north. The European colonies in Southeast Asia, especially the Dutch East Indies with their rich oil deposits, offered the resources that Japan desperately needed. Siberia, in contrast, offered few immediate riches that would justify the cost of conquering it. This divergence of strategic interests illustrates a fundamental truth about the Axis alliance. Despite the rhetoric about shared destinies and camaraderie between warrior peoples, each partner pursued its own national objectives with minimal consideration for the interests of the other. Germany wanted Japan to attack the Soviet Union because that would serve German interests. Japan wanted Germany to defeat Great Britain and keep the United States busy because that would serve Japanese interests. But neither was willing to sacrifice their own strategic plans for the sake of the other. This lack of coordination was also manifested at the operational level. Unlike the Western Allies, who established a combined Anglo-American command that coordinated operations in multiple theaters, the Axis powers never created a comparable command structure. There was no equivalent of the combined chiefs of staff that united the efforts of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Each country fought its own war, with its own chain of command, its own objectives, and its own priorities. Even the exchange of information among Axis allies was limited and selective. Although military attachés and liaison missions existed, strategic intelligence was rarely shared fully. Germany kept its advances in rocket technology and nuclear research secret. Japan withheld information about its operational plans and the capabilities of its fleet. Each ally distrusted the security of the other and feared that shared information could fall into enemy hands. Paradoxically, this lack of coordination between Axis partners benefited the Allies in significant ways. British and American intelligence services discovered that they could obtain valuable information about German plans through the reports of Japanese ambassador Oshima, which were intercepted and decrypted. Oshima, whose reports were intercepted and decrypted by the Americans, became, without knowing it, one of the most valuable intelligence sources the Allies possessed regarding Hitler's intentions and plans. But there is something that history books rarely mention, something that reveals a completely different dimension of the relationship between these two allies. What happened when the cameras stopped recording? What occurred in conversations that were never officially recorded? And what did Japanese and German soldiers really think when they met face to face, far from the propaganda speeches and diplomatic ceremonies? The answer leads us to unexpected places, to stories that remained hidden for decades, to testimonies that only came to light long after the war ended. Because the truth about the relationship between Hitler and Japan is not found solely in official documents nor in public declarations. It is found also in small gestures, in looks of distrust, in whispered comments when translators were not present. One of the most revealing episodes occurred in 1941, when a delegation of Japanese officers visited German military facilities to observe the Reich's war machinery in action. The Germans, proud of their technological superiority, showed their visitors the latest advances in tanks, planes, and artillery. But according to the testimonies of some participants, the attitude of certain German officers toward their Japanese colleagues was far from respectful. There were condescending comments about the visitors' stature, veiled jokes about their capacity to operate equipment designed for taller soldiers, looks of superiority that the Japanese, though they maintained a facade of courtesy, did not fail to notice. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who would later gain fame as the conqueror of Singapore and be known as the Tiger of Malaya, was one of the members of that delegation. Years later, some of his subordinates would recall that Yamashita had returned from Germany with mixed impressions. He admired German military efficiency, its organization, its discipline, but he had also perceived something that troubled him, an attitude of racial superiority that, although disguised by diplomatic courtesy, was impossible to ignore completely. How did this perception affect military coordination between the two allies? The answer is more significant than many imagine. The subtle but persistent distrust between Germans and Japanese translated into a reluctance to share crucial strategic information. When the Germans developed revolutionary advances in radar technology, in rockets, in jet planes, the transfer of this knowledge to Japan was slow, incomplete, and plagued with obstacles. And when the Japanese developed innovative tactics in naval and aerial warfare, particularly in the use of aircraft carriers, the Germans showed little interest in learning from their Asian ally. This lack of technological exchange would have devastating consequences for both countries. Imagine for a moment an alternative scenario. What would have happened if Germany had fully shared its V-2 rocket technology with Japan? What would have occurred if the Japanese had received the blueprints for the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter with enough time to produce it in mass? Or if the Germans had seriously studied Japanese aircraft carrier attack tactics and applied them in the Atlantic? History could have been very different, but mutual distrust, fueled in part by underlying racial tensions, prevented these possibilities from materializing. Let us now enter a particularly dark chapter of this relationship: the treatment of mixed citizens, those individuals who had both German and Japanese ancestry. In an era in which both regimes proclaimed the importance of racial purity, what happened to people who embodied a mix of the two supposedly superior races? Documents of the era reveal considerable bureaucratic confusion. Nazi officials, accustomed to classifying people into rigid racial categories, did not know exactly how to handle these cases. An internal memorandum from the German Ministry of the Interior, dated 1938, specifically addressed the question of German-Japanese marriages and their descendants. The document recognized that these cases were delicate from a diplomatic point of view and recommended handling them with discretion. Such marriages were not explicitly prohibited, but neither were they encouraged. Children of these unions remained in a racial limbo, neither fully Aryan according to the strict definition, nor classifiable as members of an inferior race. They were uncomfortable exceptions in a system that claimed to be absolute and coherent. But the contradictions did not end there. What happened to the Japanese who lived in territories occupied by Germany? How should they be treated by the occupation authorities? And what happened to the Germans residing in territories conquered by Japan in Asia? These practical questions revealed the fissures in the Axis alliance in ways that propaganda speeches tried to hide. In occupied France, for example, the small Japanese community enjoyed a privileged status compared to other foreigners. The Japanese could move freely, their businesses were protected, and German authorities had instructions to treat them with deference. But this official protection did not always translate into genuine respect at an individual level. Some testimonies from Japanese who lived in occupied Europe during the war describe experiences of subtle discrimination, difficulties in obtaining lodging, suspicious looks in public places, a persistent sensation of being tolerated but not accepted. The situation was even more complex in the Asian territories conquered by Japan. When Japanese forces captured European colonies in Southeast Asia, they found small communities of Germans who had resided there for years. How should these citizens of an allied country be treated? Official guidelines indicated that Germans should receive preferential treatment, but in practice, things did not always work out that way. Some Germans in Japanese-occupied territories complained of being treated with suspicion, of facing restrictions similar to those imposed on other Westerners, of not receiving the respect they believed they deserved as citizens of an allied nation. A particularly illustrative case was that of the Germans in Shanghai. Before the war, Shanghai hosted a prosperous German community, composed mainly of merchants and professionals. When Japan occupied the city, these Germans expected to maintain their privileged status, and in official terms, they did. They were not interned like the citizens of enemy countries, but their freedom of movement was restricted, their businesses suffered interferences, and their social position deteriorated notably. Many of them discovered that being a citizen of a country allied with Japan did not mean being treated as an equal. These daily frictions, apparently minor, revealed a deeper truth about the Axis alliance. Despite the treaties signed, the declarations of eternal friendship, the propaganda celebrating the unity of Axis peoples, racial and cultural differences continued to be formidable obstacles. Neither the Germans nor the Japanese had really abandoned their beliefs about the superiority of their own people. The alliance was a marriage of convenience between partners who, deep down, continued seeing each other with distrust. But perhaps no aspect of this relationship is more revealing than Hitler's private conversations about the future of Asia after the war. What plans did the Führer have for an Asian continent dominated by his Japanese ally? Did he really accept the idea of an Asia under Nippon control, or did he harbor secret ambitions that would have eventually clashed with Japanese interests? The testimonies of those who participated in these conversations paint a disturbing picture. Hitler expressed on several occasions his concern about what he called the awakening of Asia. He recognized that the Japanese triumph over European colonial powers had destroyed forever the myth of white man invincibility. Asian peoples, inspired by the Japanese example, would no longer passively accept European domination. This development, though beneficial in the short term for Axis interests, posed long-term problems that deeply worried Hitler. In a conversation recorded by one of his secretaries, Hitler reflected on the demographic implications of the rise of Asia. Asian peoples, he pointed out, far outnumbered Europeans. If these peoples modernized and armed themselves to the level of Western powers, the global balance of power would change irrevocably. Europe, and especially the Aryan race, would find itself in a position of numerical inferiority against the Asian masses. This perspective filled Hitler with apprehension, even while he publicly celebrated the victories of his Japanese ally. Did this mean that Hitler planned eventually to turn against Japan? Available documents do not provide a definitive answer, but they do offer suggestive clues. On several occasions, Hitler spoke of the need for Europe to unite under German leadership to face the Asian challenge. This unification, in his vision, would not be limited to the current war against the Soviet Union and the Western powers. It would be the prelude to a wider civilizational confrontation between the Aryan world and the Asian world. In this context, the alliance with Japan appears in a different light. It was not a partnership among equals intended to endure indefinitely. It was a temporary tactic, useful while the war against common enemies lasted, but expendable once those enemies were defeated. Hitler used Japan, just as Japan used Germany. Both partners pursued their own interests, fully aware that the alliance had an expiration date. This mutual instrumentalization was also manifested in the propaganda both regimes produced for their respective domestic audiences. In Germany, propaganda about Japan was carefully calibrated not to contradict Nazi racial theories too openly. Japanese warrior virtues, their discipline, their loyalty to the emperor were emphasized, qualities that resonated with values the Nazi regime tried to instill in the German population. But any suggestion that the Japanese were racially equal to Germans was carefully avoided. In Japan, propaganda about Germany followed a similar logic. German efficiency, its military might, its technological achievements were admired, but Japanese propagandists never lost sight of the narrative of Japan as leader of Asia, as liberator of Asian peoples from Western colonialism. This narrative had uncomfortable implications for the alliance with Germany, a European power that, in other circumstances, would have been classified among the colonizers to be fought. The tensions between these propaganda narratives became especially evident when Japan conquered the European colonies in Southeast Asia. The Japanese presented these conquests as liberations, as the end of white colonial yoke over Asian peoples. But what did this rhetoric mean for the alliance with Germany? If European dominion over Asia was inherently bad, was not European dominion over other parts of the world also so? Propagandists from both countries had to perform considerable rhetorical contortions to reconcile these contradictions. A particularly revealing aspect of these tensions was the propaganda treatment of India. The Indian subcontinent, under British dominion, was a potential target for both Germany and Japan. The Nazis courted Indian nationalists, especially Subhas Chandra Bose, who had fled India and sought Axis support for his fight for independence. The Japanese also cultivated relations with Bose and other Indian nationalists, establishing the Indian National Army composed of Indian prisoners of war who had decided to fight against the British. But who would control India if the Axis won the war? This question never received a clear answer, and for good reasons. Any answer would have revealed the irreconcilable tensions between German and Japanese interests. Germany had no intention of allowing Asia to fall completely under Japanese control. Japan had no intention of returning Asian conquests to its European allies. Deliberate ambiguity about the future of territories like India allowed both partners to maintain the fiction of a harmonious alliance. But let us return to the central question that guides us through this labyrinth of contradictions. Did Hitler admire the Japanese? At this point in the analysis, we can offer a more nuanced answer than a simple yes or no. Hitler admired certain aspects of Japan and the Japanese. Their military discipline, their spirit of sacrifice, their loyalty to the emperor, their capacity to modernize rapidly. These were qualities that resonated with the values Hitler tried to promote in Germany. But this admiration had clear limits. Hitler never abandoned his fundamental belief in the superiority of the Aryan race. Even when he praised the Japanese, he did so within a conceptual framework that placed them in a secondary position relative to Europeans. The Japanese were culture bearers, not creators. They had achieved great things by adopting Western technology and methods, but, according to Hitler, they would not have been capable of developing these innovations by themselves. This condescending vision manifested itself in comments Hitler made in private, far from the ears of Japanese diplomats. On one occasion, according to the testimony of one of his aides, Hitler compared the Japanese to diligent students who had learned well the lessons of their Western masters, but who lacked the creative spark necessary to surpass their teachers. On another occasion, he expressed doubts about Japan's capacity to maintain its empire in the long term, suggesting that eventually the conquered peoples would rebel against Japanese dominion. These comments reveal an attitude that we could describe as condescending admiration. Hitler recognized Japanese achievements, but he attributed them to external factors rather than to intrinsic qualities of the Japanese people. The Japanese had been successful because they had imitated the West well, not because they possessed the superior qualities Hitler attributed to the Aryan race. This attitude had practical implications for the alliance. If Hitler did not genuinely believe in the capacity of the Japanese to be equal partners, why would he share Germany's most valuable secrets with them? Why would he coordinate strategies that could benefit Japan more than Germany? The answer is that he did not, or at least not to the extent a truly close alliance would have required. Let us now examine an episode that perfectly illustrates these tensions: the attempt to transfer submarine technology between Germany and Japan. German submarines, the famous U-boats, were the most advanced in the world. They incorporated technologies like the snorkel, which allowed submarines to recharge air without surfacing completely, and state-of-the-art sonar systems. Japan, although it possessed a considerable submarine fleet, lacked many of these innovations. In theory, transferring this technology to Japan would have enormously strengthened the Axis capacity to combat Allied fleets in the Pacific. But in practice, this transfer was hindered by a multitude of problems. Some were logistical. The distance between Germany and Japan made the transport of heavy equipment or specialized technicians extremely difficult. But others were more subtle and revealing of the underlying tensions in the alliance. German engineers, according to several testimonies, were reluctant to share their most valuable secrets with the Japanese. There was a feeling, not always expressed openly, that the Japanese would simply copy German technology and eventually use it for their own ends, possibly even against German interests in the future. This distrust translated into bureaucratic delays, incomplete information, and obstacles that, although they appeared technical, had deeper roots. On the Japanese side, there was also reluctance to depend too much on German technology. Japanese naval engineers had their own professional pride and their own traditions of innovation. Accepting that the Germans were superior in submarine design was difficult to swallow for a nation that took pride in its navy. Additionally, there were practical concerns. Adapting German technology to Japanese standards required time and resources that Japan could not always afford. The result was that the transfer of submarine technology between Germany and Japan never reached its potential. Some knowledge was shared, some technicians travelled between the two countries, some blueprints changed hands, but the flow was much less than what would have been possible if the alliance had functioned as a true partnership among equals. This pattern repeated in other technological areas. German jet planes, which represented a revolutionary leap in military aviation, reached Japan too late and in insufficient quantities to make a significant difference. V-2 rockets, which Hitler considered miracle weapons capable of changing the course of the war, were never fully transferred to Japan. German advances in chemical and biological warfare, although subject to some exchanges, were also not fully shared. What would have happened if this technological collaboration had been closer? It is a fascinating counterfactual question. Japan, with full access to German rocket technology, could have developed missiles capable of attacking American targets in the Pacific. With mass-produced jet planes, Japanese air defense would have been much more effective against the American bombers that devastated Japanese cities in the final months of the war. History could have taken a very different turn, but these possibilities never materialized, in part due to logistical difficulties, but also in part due to mutual distrust that prevented full collaboration. The Axis alliance, so formidable in appearance, was undermined from within by tensions its leaders never managed to fully overcome. Let us now pass to examine the Japanese perspective in greater depth. What did Japanese leaders think about Hitler and about Germany? How did they see the alliance with a regime that, according to its own ideology, considered Asians as inferior? Japanese documents of the era reveal a complex mixture of admiration, pragmatism, and distrust. Many Japanese leaders, especially in the army, genuinely admired Germany's military achievements. The Blitzkrieg, which had conquered Poland, France, and a large part of Western Europe in a matter of months, was studied with fascination in Japanese military academies. The efficiency of the German war machine, its coordination between land and air forces, its capacity to mobilize industrial resources, all this deeply impressed Japanese strategists. But alongside this admiration was a clear awareness that Germany was not a disinterested ally. The Japanese knew that Hitler pursued his own objectives, that the alliance was a matter of mutual convenience rather than shared values. Some internal Japanese government documents expressed concern about the long-term implications of the alliance. What would happen if Germany won the war in Europe? Would it try to reclaim former German colonies in the Pacific that Japan had occupied after the First World War? Would it seek to expand its influence in Asia at the expense of Japanese interests? These concerns were never expressed publicly, of course. Japanese propaganda presented the alliance with Germany in uniformly positive terms, as an association between two great nations sharing a vision of a new world order. But behind this facade, Japanese planners carefully calculated post-war scenarios and possible frictions with their European ally. A particular area of tension was the question of the Soviet Union. As we have mentioned, Germany constantly pressured Japan to attack the Soviet Union from the east. But the Japanese had their own reasons to resist this pressure. The defeat at Khalkhin Gol had left a lasting impression on the Japanese high command. Additionally, the Neutrality Pact signed with Moscow in April 1941 served Japanese interests by allowing resources to be concentrated on the Pacific Front. German frustration with this refusal was considerable. Hitler had hoped that a Japanese attack against Siberia would force Stalin to divide his forces, relieving pressure on the Eastern Front where millions of German soldiers fought against the Red Army. When this attack did not materialize, when Japan maintained its neutrality with the Soviet Union, even while Germany bled out on the Russian steppes, many in the Nazi leadership felt betrayed. This sensation of betrayal was never expressed publicly, but it colored the German attitude toward Japan during the rest of the war. If Japan was not willing to sacrifice itself for German interests, why should Germany sacrifice itself for Japanese interests? This logic of negative reciprocity contributed to the lack of strategic coordination that characterized the Axis alliance. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the Japanese perspective is the way in which Nippon leaders interpreted Nazi racial ideology. The Japanese were fully aware that, according to the theories Hitler proclaimed, they themselves should be considered an inferior race. This awareness created a peculiar tension. How could they ally themselves with a regime whose ideology degraded them? The Japanese answer was a combination of pragmatism and irony. On one hand, Japanese leaders accepted the alliance because it served their strategic interests, independently of their partners' racial theories. On the other hand, some Japanese derived an ironic satisfaction from the situation. Here was Nazi Germany proclaiming the superiority of the Aryan race, and yet finding itself forced to ally with an Asian nation. The simple fact that Germany needed Japan was, in a certain sense, a practical refutation of the theories Hitler propagated. This irony did not escape the more perceptive Japanese. Some documents of the era contain biting observations about the hypocrisy of Nazi racial ideology when confronted with the realities of international politics. One Japanese diplomat, in an internal memorandum, observed that Hitler's theories about Aryan superiority were difficult to reconcile with the fact that Germany had actively sought an alliance with Japan. If Aryans were really superior to all other races, why did they need Asian allies to win their war? These ironic observations were never shared with German partners naturally. Diplomacy required maintaining the fictions that sustained the alliance. But they revealed that the Japanese were not naive regarding their allies' racial attitudes. They knew exactly what Hitler thought about them, and they accepted the alliance despite that knowledge, not through ignorance of it. This Japanese pragmatism was also manifested in the way Tokyo handled German demands for anti-Semitic cooperation. As we have seen, Japan rejected German pressure to implement the final solution in territories under its control. This rejection was not based on a particular love for the Jews, but on a cold evaluation of Japanese interests. Cooperating with Nazi persecution of the Jews served no Japanese strategic purpose and potentially alienated influential sectors in the United States. Pragmatism triumphed over ideological solidarity. But let us return to Hitler and his private conversations about Japan. There is a recurring theme in these testimonies that deserves special attention. Hitler's reflection on the long-term implications of the Japanese rise. As we have mentioned, Hitler was aware that Japanese victories over Western powers had fundamentally changed global racial dynamics. The myth of European invincibility had collapsed forever on the battlefields of Southeast Asia. This awareness generated mixed feelings in Hitler. On one hand, he celebrated Japanese victories as blows against common Axis enemies: Great Britain, the United States, the colonial powers that had dominated the world. On the other hand, he worried about what these victories meant for the future of European supremacy. If the Japanese could defeat Western powers in Asia, what stopped other non-European peoples from following their example? In a particularly revealing conversation, Hitler expressed his fear that the 20th century could be remembered as the century in which Europe lost its position of global dominance. World wars had weakened European powers, had destroyed empires that seemed eternal, had opened the doors to challenges from peoples who previously were considered incapable of resisting Western power. Japan was the most dramatic example of this phenomenon, but it would not be the last. These pessimistic reflections contrasted markedly with Hitler's public rhetoric about inevitable Axis victory. In his speeches, the Führer projected absolute confidence in the final triumph, in the creation of a new world order under the hegemony of superior races. But in private, doubts emerged, especially when reflecting on the significance of Japan's rise. How did Hitler reconcile these concerns about the future of Asia with his current alliance with Japan? The answer seems to be that Hitler operated in different time frames. In the short term, the alliance with Japan was necessary and beneficial. Japan kept common enemies busy, distracted resources that otherwise would have been concentrated against Germany, demonstrated that Axis powers could inflict devastating defeats on Western democracies. These immediate benefits justified the alliance, regardless of long-term concerns. But in the long term, Hitler anticipated a reconfiguration of international alliances. Once common enemies were defeated, the victorious Axis powers would inevitably begin competing among themselves for global supremacy. Europe, united under German leadership, would have to defend its interests against an Asia dominated by Japan. This future confrontation was, in Hitler's mind, almost inevitable, a logical consequence of the racial and historical forces he believed governed the fate of nations. It is important to recognize that these reflections of Hitler on the future were never translated into concrete plans of betrayal against Japan during the war. The Axis alliance was maintained until the end, although weakened by lack of coordination and mutual distrust. But Hitler's private conversations revealed that the alliance was always conceived as temporary, as a necessary expedient rather than a permanent association. Let us now delve into an aspect of the German-Japanese relationship that is rarely discussed in conventional history books: the cultural and scientific exchanges between the two countries during the period of the alliance. These exchanges, although limited by the circumstances of the war, offer a fascinating window into the way the two regimes try to build ties deeper than merely strategic ones. In the cultural sphere, both countries made significant efforts to promote mutual knowledge. Exhibitions of Japanese art were organized in Germany and German art in Japan. Literary works were translated, musicians and artists were exchanged. Study programs were established allowing students from each country to know the other's culture. These exchanges had an evident propaganda purpose: to demonstrate that the Axis alliance was based on something more than shared strategic interests, that a genuine cultural affinity existed between the German and Japanese peoples. But beyond the propaganda, some of these exchanges generated real human connections. Japanese students who spent time in Germany developed friendships with their German counterparts. Artists and academics from both countries found genuine points of contact in their respective traditions. These personal relations complicated the simplistic narratives about the alliance, introducing elements of humanity into a relationship dominated by strategic calculations and racial tensions. In the scientific sphere, exchanges were more directly useful for the war effort. German scientists traveled to Japan to share knowledge in areas like nuclear physics, materials chemistry, and aeronautical engineering. Japanese scientists visited German laboratories to study the latest innovations. These scientific exchanges, although limited by logistical difficulties and by a reluctance to share the most sensitive secrets, contributed to the technological development of both countries. A particularly interesting episode was the visit of Japanese scientists to the German nuclear program. Germany had begun investigating the possibility of developing an atomic bomb, although the program never reached the level of development of the American Manhattan Project. Some Japanese scientists visited German facilities and returned to Japan with information that contributed to the incipient Japanese nuclear program. But here too the limitations of the alliance became evident. The Germans did not share all their knowledge, and the Japanese did not completely reveal the state of their own research. What would these exchanges have meant if the war had lasted longer? Could German-Japanese scientific collaboration have produced technological advances that changed the course of the conflict? These are counterfactual questions we will never be able to answer with certainty. But clues suggest that, even with more time, the limitations inherent to the alliance would have prevented truly deep collaboration. Distrust was too ingrained, cultural differences too pronounced, national interests too divergent. Let us now enter the final months of the war, when tensions in the Axis alliance reached their peak. By 1945, it was evident to everyone except the most fanatical that the war was lost. Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances from the west and the east. Japan, although it still controlled vast territories, faced a devastating bombing campaign and the implacable advance of American forces through the Pacific. In these moments of desperation, how did Axis allies behave toward each other? The answer reveals much about the true nature of the alliance. When the Third Reich was crumbling, ties with Japan weakened rapidly. Communications between Berlin and Tokyo became sporadic and irregular. Plans for future cooperation were abandoned. Each country concentrated on its own survival, with little consideration for the interests of the other. Hitler's suicide on the 30th of April, 1945, and the unconditional surrender of Germany a few days later officially ended the German-Japanese alliance. But by then, the alliance was already a diplomatic fiction rather than an operational reality. Japan continued fighting alone for several months more until the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific War precipitated the surrender in August of 1945. Dreams of thousand-year empires vanished in ashes. How did Japanese leaders evaluate the alliance with Germany in retrospect? Documents from the post-war period reveal mixed feelings. Some Japanese leaders believed the alliance had been a strategic error that had dragged Japan into a global war it could not win. Others argued that the alliance had been necessary given the international circumstances of the time, but that it had been poorly executed due to the lack of coordination among partners. And some maintained that defeat was not due to failures in the alliance, but to the overwhelming industrial superiority of the United States. On the German side, post-war evaluations were equally varied. Some Nazi officials and functionaries interrogated by the Allies after the war expressed frustration with the lack of Japanese cooperation, especially the refusal to attack the Soviet Union. Others recognized that German expectations regarding Japan had been unrealistic from the beginning, that geographical distances and strategic differences made effective coordination impossible. But perhaps the most revealing evaluation came from Albert Speer, Hitler's architect-turned-armaments minister, who was condemned in the Nuremberg trials and spent 20 years in prison. In his memoirs, Speer reflected extensively on the alliance with Japan and on Hitler's attitudes toward his Asian partner. According to Speer, Hitler had never completely trusted the Japanese, nor had he considered them true equals. The alliance had always been a matter of convenience, a temporary tactic on the great chessboard of world geopolitics. Speer also confirmed what we have seen throughout this analysis, that Hitler expressed very different opinions about Japan, depending on the context. In public, and in the presence of Japanese diplomats, it was all praise and expressions of admiration. In private, with his inner circle, reservations and condescensions emerged. This duality, according to Speer, was characteristic of Hitler's personality and his pragmatic approach to international alliances. What lessons can we draw from this analysis of the relationship between Hitler and Japan? In the first place, history teaches us that alliances based exclusively on common enemies rarely survive the disappearance of those enemies. Germany and Japan were united by their opposition to the existing international order, but not by a shared vision of the future. Once common enemies were eliminated, latent tensions would have inevitably exploded. In the second place, history demonstrates the limits of ideology when it faces the realities of international politics. Hitler was a fanatical ideologue committed to extreme racial theories, but when those theories came into conflict with strategic needs, pragmatism prevailed. The fiction of honorary Aryans, tolerance toward a racially incompatible ally, justifications elaborated to reconcile the alliance with ideology. All this shows how ideas can be manipulated to serve the interests of power. In the third place, history reveals the importance of mutual trust in effective alliances. Germany and Japan never managed to develop the trust necessary for truly close collaboration. Distrust was manifested in reluctance to share strategic information, in the lack of military coordination, in racial tensions that emerged in personal contacts between members of the two nations. This lack of trust significantly weakened the Axis alliance and contributed to its final defeat. Finally, history reminds us that appearances can be deceiving in international relations. The Axis alliance, with its pompous ceremonies, its formal treaties, its celebratory propaganda, appeared as a formidable association between powers sharing a vision of the world. But behind the facades, tensions were deep and irreconcilable. Diplomatic smiles concealed distrusts, declarations of eternal friendship covered cynical calculations. Theories about sister races contradicted deeply ingrained beliefs about superiority and inferiority. So, did Hitler really admire the Japanese, or did he despise them? The answer, as we have seen, is not simple. Hitler admired certain aspects of the character and achievements of the Japanese, while simultaneously considering them racially inferior according to his own theories. This contradiction was never resolved. It was simply managed through convenient fictions and mental compartmentalization. Hitler was capable of praising the Japanese in a public speech and of expressing condescension toward them in a private conversation, apparently without perceiving the contradiction. This capacity to sustain contradictory beliefs is perhaps one of the most disturbing characteristics of the totalitarian mentality. Hitler was not a coherent thinker or a systematic philosopher. He was a demagogue and an opportunist who adapted his proclamations to the needs of the moment. When he needed Japanese allies, he found ways to justify the alliance. When he reflected on the future of Asia, his reservations emerged. Both positions coexisted in his mind without apparent conflict. But let us let the documents speak for themselves. Next, we will explore some of the most revealing testimonies about Hitler's attitude toward Japan. Testimonies that come from those who were closest to the dictator during the years of the alliance. Let's begin with the observations of Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister of Nazi Germany and one of the principal architects of the alliance with Japan. Ribbentrop was tried at Nuremberg and condemned to death for crimes against humanity. But before his execution, he provided extensive testimonies on the Third Reich's foreign policies, including reflections on the relationship with Japan. According to Ribbentrop, Hitler saw the alliance with Japan mainly in geopolitical terms. Japan was valuable because it kept the British and Americans busy in Asia and the Pacific, preventing them from concentrating all their resources against Germany. Racial ideology, Ribbentrop argued, was secondary to these strategic considerations. Hitler could proclaim Aryan superiority in a speech and the next day sign treaties with nations that, according to that same ideology, should be considered inferior. This pragmatic flexibility was, according to Ribbentrop, one of the defining characteristics of the Hitlerian approach to foreign policy. But Ribbentrop also admitted that the alliance with Japan had generated tensions within the Nazi leadership. Some party ideologues more rigidly committed to racial theories felt uncomfortable with the association with an Asian nation. These critics never openly challenged Hitler's policy, of course, but their reservations were expressed in subtle ways: bureaucratic resistance to exchanges with Japan, derogatory comments about Japanese visitors, reluctance to implement policies that could be seen as putting the Japanese on the same level as Germans. Hitler, according to Ribbentrop, was aware of these tensions but considered them manageable. The Führer believed that ideological coherence was less important than practical results. If the alliance with Japan helped to win the war, the objections of racial purists could be ignored. This pragmatic attitude, though effective in the short term, contributed to the contradictions that weakened the regime from within. Another revealing testimony comes from Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer and one of the oldest members of his inner circle. Hoffmann accompanied Hitler on innumerable official and private occasions, including meetings with Japanese dignitaries. His observations, though coloured by his personal loyalty to Hitler, offer fascinating details about the dictator's behaviour in the presence of his Asian allies. According to Hoffmann, Hitler was invariably polite and respectful in his interactions with the Japanese. He made a visible effort to express admiration for Japanese culture, for the discipline of the Nippon people, for the achievements of the Empire of the Rising Sun. But Hoffmann also noted something more subtle: a rigidity in Hitler's posture, an excessive formality that suggested underlying discomfort. The Führer never seemed completely relaxed in the presence of the Japanese, unlike the spontaneity he showed with his German comrades. Hoffmann also recalled occasions on which, after the Japanese visitors departed, Hitler made comments that contradicted the cordiality he had just shown. These comments often referred to physical characteristics, especially to the shorter stature of the Japanese compared to Germans. Hitler seemed to find this physical difference significant, as if it confirmed in some way the racial theories he proclaimed in other contexts. A third valuable testimony comes from Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's personal secretaries during the final years of the regime. Junge, who was very young when she began working for Hitler, wrote extensive memoirs after the war that offer a unique perspective on daily life in the Führer's environment. Although Junge was not present in high-level meetings on foreign policy, she did observe Hitler's attitudes and comments in more informal contexts. According to Junge, Hitler rarely talked about Japan in the casual conversations she witnessed. When the topic arose, generally in relation to news from the Pacific Front, Hitler expressed satisfaction for Japanese victories, but without the enthusiasm he showed for German successes. There was an emotional distance in his comments about Japan, as if he were talking about a commercial partner rather than an ally in a common fight. Junge also recalled a particularly revealing occasion. She was present when Hitler received the news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Hitler's initial reaction was one of jubilation, striking the table and exclaiming that now the United States would have to face a war on two fronts. But according to Junge, after the initial euphoria, Hitler expressed concern in private about the long-term implications. What did it mean that an Asian nation could inflict such a humiliating defeat on a Western power? What did this say about the future of European dominion in the world? These testimonies, though fragmentary and subjective, consistently paint a picture of ambivalence. Hitler valued the alliance with Japan for strategic reasons, but he never completely overcame his racial reservations toward his Asian partner. He expressed admiration when circumstances required it, but his true opinions, revealed in moments of candor, were more complex and less flattering. Let us examine now how this ambivalence was reflected in the concrete policies of the Nazi regime toward the Japanese living and working in Germany. Administrative documents from the period offer a fascinating window into the way the Nazi bureaucracy handled the contradiction between racial ideology and diplomatic needs. As we have already mentioned, the Japanese in Germany officially enjoyed the status of honorary Aryans. This meant they were exempt from most of the racial restrictions applied to other non-European groups. They could live where they wanted, work in any profession, use the same public facilities as Germans. In theory, they were to be treated with the same respect as citizens of any friendly nation. But theory did not always coincide with practice. Archives of the period contain numerous complaints from Japanese citizens about incidents of discrimination. Some reported difficulties in renting housing, with landlords expressing preference for German tenants. Others described hostile looks in public places, derogatory comments heard in passing, a general sensation of not being welcome despite official guarantees. Nazi authorities took these complaints seriously, at least in formal terms. When a Japanese citizen filed an official complaint, the bureaucracy generally responded with investigations and, in some cases, with reprimands to the Germans involved. The government was committed to maintaining the fiction of a harmonious alliance, and incidents of discrimination against Japanese threatened that fiction. A particularly illustrative case involved a Japanese student in Berlin who was rejected from a social club frequented by young Germans. The student filed a complaint with the authorities, arguing that the rejection violated the honorary Aryan status the Japanese supposedly enjoyed. The complaint escalated through the bureaucracy until it finally reached the Ministry of the Interior. The official decision was that the club had acted incorrectly and must admit the Japanese student if he applied for membership again. This case, though minor in the general context of the war, illustrates the tensions that the alliance with Japan generated within the Nazi system. Bureaucrats found themselves forced to make exceptions to racial policies that were supposedly absolute. German citizens received contradictory messages. On one hand, propaganda told them the Aryan race was superior to all others. On the other hand, they were ordered to treat the Japanese as equals. This cognitive dissonance was difficult to manage, and incidents of discrimination were symptoms of this difficulty. But tensions were not limited to individual incidents. They also manifested in the institutional policies of the Nazi regime toward Japan. Consider, for example, the question of German-Japanese mixed marriages. The Nuremberg laws strictly prohibited marriages between Germans and Jews, as well as between Germans and members of other races considered unacceptable. But what happened with marriages between Germans and Japanese? Documents reveal that this question never received a clear resolution. Officially, such marriages were not prohibited, given the special status of the Japanese, but they were also not encouraged, and Germans considering marrying Japanese often faced social pressure and bureaucratic obstacles. Officials in charge of approving these marriages tended to proceed with caution, requesting additional documentation, conducting investigations into the Japanese party's background, delaying approvals through bureaucratic procedures. An internal memorandum from the Ministry of the Interior, dated 1940, addressed specifically this question. The document recognized that German-Japanese marriages could not be prohibited without causing a diplomatic incident with an important ally. But it also expressed concern about the implications of such unions for the racial purity of the German people. The proposed solution was a policy of discreet discouragement, not to prohibit these marriages, but also not to facilitate them, hoping that bureaucratic difficulties would deter most interested couples. This policy of discreet discouragement was characteristic of the Nazi approach to many of the contradictions generated by the alliance with Japan. Instead of resolving contradictions openly, the regime managed them through ambiguities, exceptions, and bureaucratic procedures that allowed for simultaneously maintaining racial ideology and the diplomatic alliance. The result was a system full of inconsistencies that functioned only thanks to the willingness of all involved to ignore the most evident contradictions. Let us move now to examine a particularly fascinating aspect of the German-Japanese relationship: joint intelligence operations between the two countries. Although strategic coordination between Germany and Japan was notoriously deficient, in the field of intelligence there were some collaborative efforts that deserve attention. Intelligence services from both countries exchanged information about common enemies. The Germans shared what they knew about British and American military capabilities, while the Japanese provided information on Allied defenses in Asia and the Pacific. This exchange, although limited, offered each country a window into theaters of operations where they had no direct presence. But the exchange of intelligence was also plagued by the same distrusts that characterized other aspects of the alliance. The Germans suspected that the Japanese did not share all relevant information, especially regarding their own operational plans. The Japanese, for their part, believed that the Germans withheld their most valuable technological secrets. These suspicions, although rarely expressed openly, colored all interactions between the intelligence services of the two countries. A particularly intriguing episode involved intelligence efforts related to the American nuclear program. Both Germany and Japan received clues that the United States was working on a bomb of unprecedented destructive power. Intelligence services from both countries tried to obtain information on this program, with limited results. There were some exchanges of what each country had managed to find out, but the information shared was fragmentary and incomplete. What neither of the two countries managed to understand was the scale of the American Manhattan Project. The thousands of scientists, the billions of dollars, the massive infrastructure dedicated to developing the atomic bomb, all this escaped the imagination of the Axis intelligence services. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the surprise was total. The weapon that ended the war was something that neither Germans nor Japanese had managed to anticipate fully. But let us return to the central theme of our analysis. What do intelligence operations tell us about the true nature of the relationship between Hitler and Japan? The answer is consistent with what we have seen in other fields: a limited collaboration plagued by distrusts which never reached its potential due to the underlying tensions between the partners. Intelligence, more than any other aspect of military cooperation, requires mutual trust. Sharing sensitive information means risking that information falling into the wrong hands or being used against the one sharing it. Truly effective alliances, such as the one uniting Great Britain and the United States, were characterized by an extraordinarily open exchange of intelligence. The Western allies shared almost everything they knew, trusting that their partners would use that information for the common benefit. The Axis alliance never reached this level of trust. Germany and Japan shared information selectively, withholding what they considered most valuable, constantly suspecting the other's intentions. This mutual distrust significantly weakened the efficacy of the alliance and contributed to the lack of strategic coordination that was one of the Axis's main weaknesses during the war. Let us explore now a different dimension of the German-Japanese relationship: the propaganda directed at the populations of the respective countries. How did the Nazis present Japan to the German public? And how did the Japanese present Germany to their own population? The answers to these questions reveal much about the tensions and the fictions that sustained the alliance. In Germany, propaganda about Japan emphasized the warrior virtues of the Nippon people. There was talk of Japanese discipline, of the spirit of sacrifice, of absolute loyalty to the emperor. These were qualities that resonated with the values the Nazi regime tried to instill in the German population. By celebrating these virtues in the Japanese, propaganda implicitly proposed them as models to imitate. But Nazi propaganda about Japan was careful to avoid any suggestion of racial equality. It was emphasized that the Japanese were valuable allies, partners in the fight against common enemies, but they were not presented as racially equivalent to the Germans. The distinction was subtle but important. The Japanese deserved respect for their achievements, but that respect did not imply they were equal in the racial sense that Nazi ideology considered fundamental. An illustrative example of this calibrated propaganda was the treatment of Japanese victories in the Pacific. When Japan conquered Singapore or the Philippines, the German press celebrated these successes as blows against the common enemy. But comments emphasized the weakness of European colonial powers more than the intrinsic strength of the Japanese. The implicit message was that Great Britain and the United States were being defeated not because the Japanese were superior, but because Western democracies were decadent and divided. But here arises a question that Nazi propagandists could never answer satisfactorily. If Japanese victories were due solely to Western weakness, why did Germany need an ally to defeat those same supposedly decadent enemies? This logical contradiction was evident to anyone who thought critically about the propaganda message. But in a totalitarian regime where critical thinking was dangerous, few people dared to point out such inconsistencies. And what happened on the other side of the world? How did Japanese propaganda present its German ally to the Nippon population? The answer reveals fascinating symmetries and differences with the German approach. In Japan, propaganda about Germany emphasized the Reich's technological and military achievements. The Blitzkrieg, German industrial efficiency, Wehrmacht discipline were admired. These elements resonated with the values the Japanese regime also promoted: modernization, military might, national organization. By celebrating these aspects of Germany, Japanese propaganda implicitly validated its own program of militarization and expansion. But Japanese propaganda also had its own tensions to manage. The Nippon regime promoted the idea of Japan as leader of Asia, as liberator of Asian peoples from Western colonialism. This narrative implied that all Westerners, including Germans, were essentially colonizers whose dominion over Asia must end. How to reconcile this anti-Western narrative with the alliance with a European power? The Japanese solution was to emphasize that Germany was different from other European powers. Germany, according to this narrative, was also a marginalized nation, a victim of the international order imposed by Great Britain, France, and the United States after the First World War. Germany and Japan shared the status of revisionist nations, of powers seeking to challenge an unjust system that had excluded them from their legitimate place in the world. This shared narrative of victimization allowed for justifying the alliance without contradicting the anti-Western rhetoric too openly. A particularly interesting element of Japanese propaganda about Germany was the treatment of Nazism as an ideology. Unlike the Nazis, who tried to export their racial ideology to other countries, the Japanese showed little interest in adopting the specific theories of National Socialism. Japanese propaganda praised Germany without necessarily endorsing Nazism as a universal doctrine. This selective approach allowed Japan to maintain its own ideological identity while collaborating with a regime whose theories, if applied consistently, would degrade the Japanese themselves. But the contradictions could not be hidden completely, not even with the most sophisticated propaganda. And nowhere were these contradictions more evident than in the treatment of prisoners of war and civilian populations by the two Axis allies. What do the atrocities committed by Germans and Japanese reveal about their respective worldviews and about the nature of their alliance? This is a difficult but necessary question because it leads us to the heart of the ideologies that animated both regimes. The Nazis committed their worst atrocities against specific groups defined by racial and ideological criteria: Jews, Roma, Slavs, the disabled, homosexuals, political opponents. The Holocaust was a systematic program of extermination based on pseudoscientific racial classifications. Nazi brutality was ideologically motivated, directed at specific groups considered racial or political enemies of the Reich. Japanese atrocities followed a different logic: the brutal mistreatment of prisoners of war, the massacres of civilians in China and other occupied territories, the medical experiments of Unit 731. All these atrocities were motivated by a combination of national supremacism, contempt for those who surrendered instead of fighting to the death, and a military culture that glorified cruelty toward defeated enemies. Although both sets of atrocities were horrendous, they reflected distinct ideologies. The Nazis categorized humanity into hierarchically ordered races. The Japanese emphasized the superiority of their nation and their warrior spirit over all other peoples, without necessarily adopting the elaborate racial taxonomies of the Nazis. This ideological difference was manifested in the way each regime treated the citizens of the other. As we have seen, the Japanese in Germany and the Germans in Japan generally enjoyed privileged treatment compared to other foreigners. But this privilege reflected diplomatic considerations rather than genuine ideological affinity. Each regime protected the other's citizens because the alliance required it, not because their ideologies dictated it. What would have happened if the war had ended differently? How would the Nazis have treated the Japanese in a world dominated by the Axis? And how would the Japanese have treated the Germans in an Asia under Nippon hegemony? These counterfactual questions can never be answered with certainty, but the clues we have examined suggest that coexistence would have been difficult. The racial and ideological tensions that were temporarily suppressed during the war would have inevitably emerged once common enemies were defeated. Let us deepen now into an aspect of the German-Japanese relationship that deserves special attention: the submarine missions that tried to connect the two allies across half the world. These missions, risky and often tragic, offer a fascinating window into the desperate efforts to keep the alliance functioning despite the enormous geographical distances. The distance between Germany and Japan was one of the greatest obstacles to effective cooperation between the two allies. There were no safe routes for transporting materials, personnel, or information between Europe and East Asia. Territory controlled by the Allies, enemy fleets, and air patrols made any direct communication other than by radio practically impossible. Submarines offered a partial solution to this problem. A submarine could travel submerged, evading enemy detection, and carry small but valuable cargoes between the two extremes of the Axis alliance. Starting from 1942, both countries began planning regular submarine missions to exchange technology, strategic materials, and specialized personnel. These missions, known as Yanagi, willow in Japanese by the Nippon side, faced extraordinary challenges. A submarine departing from France or Norway had to cross the Atlantic, round the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa, cross the Indian Ocean, and finally reach Japanese ports in Southeast Asia or in Japan itself. The journey could last several months and expose crews to innumerable dangers. Despite these obstacles, several missions managed to complete successfully. German submarines reached Penang, Singapore, and other ports controlled by Japan, transporting technical blueprints, radar components, material samples, and specialists in various technologies. Japanese submarines made the reverse trip, carrying raw materials scarce in Europe such as rubber, tin, and tungsten. But many more missions ended in tragedy. Submarines were sunk by Allied patrols, lost in storms, or simply disappeared without a trace. The crews of these submarines, both German and Japanese, faced daunting odds of surviving their missions. They were, in a certain sense, the human sacrifices that the Axis alliance demanded to stay functioning. A particularly moving case was that of the Japanese submarine 52, which departed from Kure, Japan, in March 1944, bound for France. The submarine was transporting 2 tons of gold to pay for German technology, in addition to rubber, opium, and other valuable materials. It also carried on board 14 Japanese technicians who were to study the latest German advances in radar and other technologies. The I-52 never reached its destination. In June 1944, when it was in the middle of the Atlantic, it was detected by American planes equipped with state-of-the-art radar. An acoustic torpedo, technology the Japanese were unaware of, struck the submarine and sent it to the bottom of the ocean with all its crew and cargo. The 108 crew members and passengers died instantly. The gold from the I-52 remained at the bottom of the Atlantic for decades, at more than 5,000 meters depth. It was not until 1995 that a treasure hunting expedition located the remains of the submarine and recovered part of the cargo. The discovery generated legal controversy about who was the legitimate owner of the gold: the descendants of the original Japanese owners, the Japanese government, or the treasure hunters who had found it. But beyond legal questions, the case of the I-52 illustrates the human sacrifices that the German-Japanese alliance demanded. 108 people died trying to maintain a collaboration functioning between two countries separated by half the world. Their deaths, like those of so many others who perished in similar missions, were the human cost of an alliance that, as we have seen, was plagued by tensions and distrusts. Were these sacrifices worth it? Did submarine missions manage to significantly strengthen the Axis alliance? Evidence suggests that the impact was limited. The amounts of materials transported were small compared to the needs of both countries. Shared technology often arrived too late to make a significant difference, and the loss of submarines and crews represented a cost that neither of the two allies could easily afford. But submarine missions also had a symbolic value that went beyond their practical utility. They demonstrated that the Axis alliance was more than words on paper, that both countries were willing to risk lives and resources to maintain collaboration. In a sense, submarine missions were gestures of good faith, tests of commitment in an alliance where trust was scarce. Let us now enter the final months of the alliance, when the collapse of the Third Reich forced a rethink of all the assumptions on which the German-Japanese relationship had been built. What happened when Germany fell? How did Japan react to the defeat of its main European ally? And what do these reactions reveal about the true nature of the alliance? The spring of 1945 was apocalyptic for the Third Reich. Soviet armies advanced from the east, Anglo-American forces from the west, and German territory shrank day by day. Hitler, a refugee in his bunker under the Berlin Chancellery, alternated between fantasies of final victory and moments of absolute desperation. On the 30th of April, with Soviet troops a few blocks away, Hitler took his own life along with Eva Braun, his wife of just a few hours. News of Hitler's death took time to reach Japan due to interrupted communications. When it was finally confirmed, official Japanese reaction was one of formal lament for the loss of an ally, but without the genuine mourning that would have accompanied the death of a truly admired leader. Official communiques expressed ritual condolences, but behind the formalities, Japanese leaders were already calculating the implications of the German defeat for their own situation. The unconditional surrender of Germany on the 8th of May 1945 left Japan as the only surviving member of the original Axis. Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies in September 1943, and now Germany had also fallen. Japan faced alone the most powerful coalition the world had ever seen. What options did Japan have at this moment? Some Japanese leaders recognized that defeat was inevitable and advocated for seeking a negotiated peace before the situation worsened even further. Others insisted on continuing to fight, hoping that Japanese determination would eventually exhaust the Allies' will to continue the war. And a third group fantasized about miracle weapons or divine interventions that would reverse the situation. Ironically, some of the Japanese advocating for continuing the war used the example of German resistance as an argument. If Germany had fought to the end, if Hitler had preferred death over surrender, should Japan not demonstrate the same determination? This argument conveniently ignored that German resistance to the end had resulted in the total destruction of the country, in millions of additional deaths, and in sufferings that an earlier surrender would have avoided. But the final decision would not depend on internal Japanese debates. On the 6th of August 1945, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion killed instantly between 70,000 and 80,000 people, with tens of thousands more dying in the following weeks and months from injuries and radiation. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki, causing comparable destruction. The same day as the Nagasaki bombing, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and began invading Manchuria. The neutrality pact Japan had maintained with Moscow throughout the war, the same pact that had frustrated German hopes of a Japanese attack against Siberia, was unilaterally abrogated by Stalin. Japan now faced not only the threat of more atomic bombs, but also the perspective of a Soviet invasion of its territories on the Asian continent. Before this combination of pressures, Emperor Hirohito took the extraordinary decision to intervene personally to put an end to the war. On the 15th of August 1945, in an unprecedented radio broadcast, the emperor announced to his people that Japan accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration and surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The Japanese surrender marked the definitive end of the Axis alliance. What had begun with the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 ended less than a decade later in ashes and defeat. Dreams of a new world order under the dominion of Germany, Italy, and Japan had vanished forever. But the end of the war did not mean the end of questions about the German-Japanese alliance. What lessons could be drawn from this experience? What did it reveal about the nature of international alliances, about the relationship between ideology and politics, about the possibilities and limits of cooperation between culturally different nations? Historians have debated these questions for decades, and the debate continues today. Some emphasize similarities between the Nazi and Japanese regimes: authoritarianism, militarism, extreme nationalism, the willingness to use massive violence to achieve their objectives. From this perspective, the Axis alliance had a deep logic, uniting regimes sharing fundamental values, although they differed in details. Other historians emphasize differences between the two regimes. Nazi racism, with its obsession for Aryan purity and its program of extermination of entire groups of human beings, had no exact equivalent in Japan. The Japanese emperor, despite being used as a symbol of extreme nationalism, was a very different figure from the charismatic Führer who dominated Nazi Germany. Power structures, cultural traditions, social bases of the two regimes were distinct in significant ways. Which of these perspectives is correct? Probably both contain elements of truth. The German-Japanese alliance was both a union of similar regimes and an association of convenience between very different partners. Similarities allowed the alliance to form. Differences guaranteed it would never function as effectively as it could have done. Let us return now for the last time to our original question: did Hitler actually admire the Japanese, or did he despise them? After everything we have examined, after analyzing documents, testimonies, policies and behaviors, what conclusion can we offer? The answer, as we have seen repeatedly, is that Hitler expressed admiration for certain aspects of the character and Japanese achievements, while simultaneously considering them racially inferior according to his own theories. This contradiction was never resolved. It was simply managed through convenient fictions like the concept of honorary Aryans, and through mental compartmentalization that allowed Hitler to sustain incompatible beliefs without apparent conflict. But perhaps the question itself is poorly posed. Asking if Hitler admired or despised the Japanese assumes we must choose between these two options when evidence suggests both attitudes coexisted. Hitler could admire Japanese discipline in a speech and express racial condescension in a private conversation, apparently without perceiving the contradiction. This capacity to sustain contradictory beliefs was, as we have noted, a characteristic of the totalitarian mentality that Hitler embodied. What the history of the relationship between Hitler and Japan teaches us is not only about the past, but also about the dynamics still operating in contemporary international relations. Alliances based exclusively on common enemies without genuine shared values tend to be fragile and ineffective. Ideologies can be adapted and manipulated to serve the interests of power, but the resulting contradictions eventually manifest. And distrust between partners, although it can be temporarily suppressed by strategic needs, inevitably undermines effective collaboration. These lessons have relevance far beyond the specific context of the Second World War. Each time we observe international alliances forming and dissolving, each time we see leaders making public declarations that contradict their private positions, each time we witness the tension between ideology and pragmatism in world politics, we are seeing echoes of the dynamics we examined in the relationship between Hitler and Japan. History, as is often said, does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And the rhymes between the past and the present are more audible when we pay careful attention to detail, to contradictions, to tensions hidden behind official facades. The alliance between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, with all its complexities and contradictions, offers an invaluable case study for understanding these dynamics. What would Hitler have thought if he could have seen post-war Japan? Close ally of the United States, global economic power, stable democracy. Probably he would have found in this development a confirmation of his theories. The Japanese, deprived of the Aryan influence that according to him explained their previous achievements, eventually would adopt Western models just as he had predicted. But this interpretation would have ignored the deeper evidence. That Japan prospered precisely when it abandoned the militarism and extreme nationalism that had led it to the alliance with Nazi Germany. That its post-war success refuted, not confirmed, Hitler's racial theories. And so we reach the end of our journey through this complex and disturbing history. We have examined the origins of the German-Japanese alliance, the ideological tensions that accompanied it, the efforts to reconcile political cooperation with Nazi racial theories, the signs of mutual distrust hidden behind the facades of friendship. We have explored the submarine missions that tried to keep the two allies connected, the intelligence operations plagued by secrets, the propaganda calibrated for different audiences in each country. We have seen how Hitler admired certain aspects of the Japanese character, while simultaneously considering them racially inferior. We have examined how the Nazis invented the fiction of honorary Aryans to justify an ideologically uncomfortable alliance. And we have reflected on what this history teaches us about the nature of international alliances, about the relationship between ideology and pragmatism, about the possibilities and limits of cooperation between culturally different nations. The alliance between Hitler and Japan was, in the end, a marriage of convenience that concealed deep and irreconcilable distrusts. It was based on shared interests, not shared values. It was sustained by ideological fictions, not genuine affinities. And it would have collapsed inevitably if it had reached its declared objectives. But perhaps the most important lesson of this history is also the most unsettling. Totalitarian regimes, as we have seen, are capable of sustaining contradictions that would be intolerable in more open and rational systems. They can proclaim absolute principles while constantly violating them in practice. They can create elaborate fictions to justify the unjustifiable. And they can convince millions of people that these contradictions do not exist or do not matter. This capacity for institutionalized cognitive dissonance did not disappear with the Axis defeat. It continues manifesting in various forms in the contemporary world, each time authoritarian regimes proclaim values that systematically contradict their actions. Recognizing this dynamic, understanding how it functions, is essential to resisting it. And that is why studying cases like the alliance between Hitler and Japan continues to be relevant, not as an academic exercise, but as preparation for the challenges of the present and the future. That was all for now. In the next segment, we will continue exploring the more hidden dimensions of this fascinating and disturbing relationship between two of the most destructive regimes in history. What secrets still remain unrevealed? What classified documents contain information that would change our understanding of these events? And what additional lessons can we extract for the world in which we live today? The answers to these questions await us in the next installment of this series. Tell us in the comments what aspect of the relationship between Hitler and Japan has surprised you most. Did you know the Nazis created the category of honorary Aryans specifically to accommodate their Japanese allies? And what do you think about the lessons this history offers for understanding international alliances of our time? Your opinion matters to us, and we want to hear it. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, activate the bell to receive notifications of new videos, and share this content with friends and family who enjoy learning about history. Each subscription, each like, each comment helps us continue producing quality content on the most fascinating themes of the past. Together we can reach our goal of 1 million subscribers and build a community of people passionate about history. Until the next video. And remember, history not only tells us what happened, but warns us about what could happen again if we forget its lessons. But wait, because there is much more to tell. Did you really believe we had exhausted all the secrets of this alliance? What follows could completely change your perspective on everything you have heard until now. There exists a document that remained classified for more than 50 years, a document revealing conversations between Japanese diplomats and Nazi officials that never should have been made public. In these conversations, captured by Allied intelligence services but kept in secret for decades, plans for the post-war world were discussed that would have horrified anyone who read them. Plans that demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that neither Germans nor Japanese saw their alliance as permanent. What exactly did these documents contain? Why were they classified for so long? And what do they reveal to us about Hitler's true intentions toward his Asian allies? To understand the context of these revelations, we must go back to the first months of 1942. The war was at a turning point. Japan had just achieved its series of spectacular victories in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Germany controlled most of continental Europe and was advancing deep into Soviet territory. For a brief moment, it appeared the Axis could really win the war. It was in this context of apparent triumph that the most revealing conversations took place. With victory apparently within reach, planners from both countries began to seriously discuss how the world would be divided after the war, and that was when latent tensions began to emerge. Japanese documents from this era, decrypted by American cryptanalysts of the project known as MAGIC, reveal a growing concern in Tokyo about German intentions. Japanese diplomats in Berlin reported that their Nazi counterparts made ambiguous comments about the future of Asia. There was talk of spheres of influence, of demarcation lines, of arrangements that would guarantee that the interests of both powers were respected. But details were never clearly defined, and the Japanese suspected this ambiguity was deliberate. A particularly revealing dispatch sent from Berlin to Tokyo in March 1942 expressed Ambassador Oshima's unease about a conversation with Ribbentrop. The German foreign minister had mentioned almost in passing that Germany expected to recover its former colonies in the Pacific after the war. These colonies, which Japan had occupied after the First World War and which now formed part of the Japanese Empire, were evidently a delicate theme. Oshima had responded with diplomatic evasions, but the message to Tokyo was clear. The Germans had not forgotten their old possessions and could reclaim them in the future. How did the Japanese government react to this revelation? Documents show that Oshima was ordered to discreetly investigate to what point this position represented official German policy. The answers he received were contradictory. Some Nazi officials minimized the importance of the old colonies, while others suggested it would eventually be necessary to discuss their status. This ambiguity only increased Japanese suspicions. But tensions were not limited to specific territorial questions. There were more fundamental disagreements on the nature of the New World Order both powers claimed to want to create. The Nazis imagined a world dominated by races, with Aryans at the top and all other people subordinated in various degrees. The Japanese imagined a world divided into civilizational spheres, with Japan leading Asia and Europe left to the Europeans. These visions were superficially compatible, but contained deep contradictions that eventually would have generated conflicts. What would have happened, for example, with India in a world dominated by the Axis? The Nazis considered Indians as an inferior race, incapable of governing themselves effectively. The Japanese promoted the idea of liberating Asian peoples, including Indians, from Western dominion. If the Axis had won the war, these incompatible visions would have inevitably clashed. Would India be a colony governed according to Nazi racial principles, or an independent state under the Japanese sphere of influence? There was no answer that satisfied both partners. Similar tensions existed regarding China, Southeast Asia, Australia, all the regions where German and Japanese interests potentially overlapped. The Axis alliance worked while there were common enemies to fight. But in a victory scenario, these tensions would have exploded into open conflicts. The documents also reveal something perhaps even more disturbing, indications that some planners on both sides already anticipated an eventual conflict between Germany and Japan. A German memorandum, dated at the end of 1942, discussed the need to maintain a significant naval presence in the Indian Ocean after the war, ostensibly to protect commercial routes, but implicitly to counteract Japanese influence in the region. A Japanese document from approximately the same period expressed concern about possible German attempts to establish naval bases in the Indian Ocean and suggested that Japan should act preventively to ensure control of key strategic points. These documents were never shared among the Allies, of course. Each side secretly planned for a future in which the other could become a rival. The Axis alliance, even in its moments of greatest closeness, was undermined by this mutual distrust about the future. Why were these documents classified for so long? The answer has to do with Cold War politics. After 1945, both West Germany and Japan became crucial allies of the United States in their confrontation with the Soviet Union. Revealing documents showing aggressive intentions and internal tensions of the former Axis could have complicated these new alliances. It was more convenient to maintain focus on Axis crimes and on the need for continuous vigilance against totalitarianism, without entering into details that could result embarrassing for the new partners. Additionally, some of these documents contained information on intelligence methods that continued to be sensitive. Revealing exactly how the Americans had decrypted Japanese communications could compromise ongoing operations against other adversaries. For these reasons, the most revealing documents remained classified for decades, coming to light only gradually as their sensitivity diminished. But now that we have access to these documents, what do they teach us about the question that has guided us throughout this analysis? Did Hitler actually admire the Japanese, or did he despise them? The documents confirm what we have seen through other testimonies, that Hitler expressed selective admiration for the Japanese, while simultaneously seeing them as temporary allies whose utility had an expiration date. In a conversation recorded in these documents, Hitler commented to one of his generals that Japan was like a tiger, that it was convenient to have as an ally while hunting the same prey, but that eventually it would be necessary to ensure the tiger did not turn against the one who had fed it. This animal metaphor is revealing. Hitler saw the Japanese not as comrades in a shared fight, but as predators, whose ferocity was useful in the moment but potentially dangerous in the long term. The admiration he expressed for their warrior spirit was mixed with an instinctive distrust toward a people who, according to his own theories, should be subordinated to the Aryans, but who clearly would not accept such subordination. The documents also reveal conversations in which Hitler discussed with his advisors the need to prepare for an eventual conflict with Japan. These conversations were speculative and long-term, centered on post-war scenarios Hitler hoped to see realized. But the simple fact that they took place demonstrates that the alliance with Japan was never conceived as permanent in the Führer's mind. On the Japanese side, the documents show a similar awareness of the alliance's limitations. Japanese diplomats in Europe regularly reported on the Nazis' racial attitudes and expressed their concern about long-term implications. A particularly biting dispatch observed that the Nazis treated the Japanese with an exaggerated courtesy that appeared designed to hide an underlying condescension. The diplomat who wrote this dispatch concluded that Japan should maintain the alliance as long as it was useful, but should not have illusions about its true nature. These pragmatic evaluations, both from the German and Japanese side, confirm the picture we have built throughout this analysis. The Axis alliance was a marriage of convenience between partners who used each other without genuinely trusting one another. Expressions of admiration and camaraderie were real at a certain superficial level, but hid deep reservations that would have inevitably emerged if the alliance had survived the war. Let's deepen now into an aspect of the German-Japanese relationship that deserves special attention: the exchanges of military personnel between the two countries. These exchanges, although limited by the circumstances of the war, offer fascinating windows into the attitudes of soldiers and officers from each country toward their counterparts from the other. Throughout the war, several Japanese officers visited Germany to observe German military operations and study Wehrmacht tactics and technologies. Similarly, some German officers traveled to territories controlled by Japan to observe Japanese operations in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. These exchanges, although mainly technical in their purpose, generated personal interactions that reveal the underlying attitudes of both sides. Testimonies of Japanese officers who visited Germany show a mixture of professional admiration and personal discomfort. They admired German efficiency, the organization of the Nazi war machine, the discipline of German soldiers. But they also noted attitudes that made them uncomfortable, looks of curiosity that felt like evaluations, comments on physical differences that appeared more than merely observational, a general sensation of being treated like exotic specimens rather than professional colleagues. A Japanese officer who visited the Eastern Front in 1942 left a diary that was discovered after the war. In it, he described his impressions with a frankness he probably would not have expressed in official reports. He wrote about his admiration for the determination of German soldiers fighting in terrible conditions against the Red Army. But he also wrote about incidents that disturbed him. A German officer who made a comment about the slanted eyes of Asians, another who expressed surprise that a Japanese person could speak German so well, a third who asked if it was true that the Japanese ate raw fish, with a tone suggesting the practice appeared barbaric to him. These incidents, individually minor, collectively painted a picture of an alliance where professional respect coexisted with persistent racial prejudices. The Germans could admire Japanese victories while simultaneously considering the Japanese as fundamentally different and ultimately inferior according to the criteria their ideology established. On the German side, officers who visited territories controlled by Japan also left revealing testimonies. A German military attaché in Tokyo wrote extensively on his observations of the Japanese army. He admired their combat spirit, their readiness for sacrifice, their physical resistance in extreme conditions. But he also expressed reservations about certain aspects of Japanese military culture that appeared incomprehensible or even barbaric to him. Suicide rituals, the treatment of prisoners of war, strict hierarchies that appeared to stifle individual initiative. These observations reveal the deep cultural differences that separated the two allies even when they shared military objectives. The Germans and Japanese had distinct military cultures forged by different histories and traditions. They could cooperate against common enemies, but they never managed to truly understand each other. A particularly illustrative episode of these cultural differences occurred during the visit of a Japanese delegation to a camp for Soviet prisoners of war in Germany. The Germans, proud of their administrative efficiency, showed their visitors how they organized the prisoners, how they classified them according to labor utility, how they managed rations and housing. The Japanese observed everything with interest, but, according to a later testimony, expressed confusion as to why the Germans bothered to keep so many prisoners alive. In Japanese military culture of the time, surrendering was such a great dishonor that prisoners hardly deserved to be treated as beings with rights. The idea of feeding and housing millions of Soviet prisoners appeared, from the Japanese perspective, a waste of resources. This difference in attitude toward prisoners of war illustrates a disturbing paradox. The Nazis were responsible for some of the worst atrocities against prisoners of war in history, especially against the Soviets, of whom millions died in German captivity. And yet, even the Nazis maintained an appearance of system, of procedures, of administration. The Japanese, in certain contexts, were even more brutal in their absolute contempt for those who had surrendered. What did these differences reveal about the ideologies of the two regimes? The Nazis categorized humanity according to racial criteria and treated different groups of prisoners differently according to their racial classification. Western prisoners generally received better treatment than Soviet prisoners or prisoners from racially despised groups. The Japanese, in contrast, applied a more uniform contempt toward all prisoners, based not so much on their race as on the simple fact of having surrendered. These ideological differences created incompatibilities that, although rarely discussed openly, contributed to the lack of integration among Axis forces. The Germans and Japanese fought their own war according to their own principles, cooperating when convenient, but never truly fusing their efforts. Let's continue exploring the more hidden dimensions of this relationship. What happened with the ordinary citizens of each country? How did ordinary Germans perceive their Japanese allies? And how did ordinary Japanese perceive the Germans? Official propaganda of both regimes tried to create a positive image of the ally. In Germany, newsreels showed Japanese victories in the Pacific with approval, emphasizing the blows inflicted on common enemies. In Japan, media celebrated German advances in Europe and presented Germany as a valuable partner in the fight against Western powers. But propaganda did not always reflect popular attitudes. Testimonies of the time suggest that many ordinary Germans saw the Japanese with a mixture of curiosity and incomprehension. Japan was a faraway country about which most Germans knew little. Propaganda images showed disciplined warriors and modern cities, but the reality of Japanese life continued being mysterious for the majority. Some Germans expressed genuine admiration for Japanese achievements. Victories over European colonial powers impressed, although this admiration was often mixed with unease about what these victories meant for the future of Western power in Asia. Other Germans expressed more clearly racist attitudes, seeing the Japanese as a strange people whose alliance was necessary but uncomfortable. In Japan, attitudes toward Germany were equally mixed. Many Japanese admired German technology and efficiency, which had been the object of fascination since the Meiji era when Japan modernized, taking Western powers as models. But there was also an awareness that Germany was, after all, a Western power, part of the same world that had colonized Asia and that Japan claimed to want to liberate. The communities of each country residing in the other's territory offer a window into these attitudes. Germans in Japan generally reported being treated with respect and courtesy, but they also noted a certain distance, a sensation of not being completely accepted despite the official alliance. Japanese in Germany experienced something similar. Correct but not warm treatment, official respect but personal reservations. A revealing incident occurred in Berlin in 1943. A group of Japanese students attending German universities organized a celebration for Emperor Hirohito's birthday. The Japanese embassy had obtained the necessary permits and expected the event to proceed without problems. But when some of the students tried to hang a Japanese flag on a public building, they were confronted by German citizens who apparently did not understand or did not accept that these Asians had the right to exhibit their national symbol on German soil. The incident was minor and was resolved quickly with the intervention of authorities. But it revealed the underlying tensions that official propaganda could not eliminate completely. For some Germans, the idea of treating Asians as equals continued being difficult to accept, independently of what official treaties said. And what happened when Germans and Japanese met in less formal contexts? Testimonies from sailors and soldiers who interacted with their counterparts from the other country offer interesting perspectives. In Southeast Asian ports where German submarines docked for refueling, German and Japanese crews sometimes shared moments of camaraderie. Gifts were exchanged, drinks were shared, conversations were attempted despite linguistic barriers. These personal encounters often generated more positive impressions than abstract attitudes fostered by ideology. A German sailor could discover that his Japanese counterparts shared the same concerns about family, the same boredom during long hours of watch, the same fear before danger. These human connections transcended, at least momentarily, the racial categories the official regimes promoted. But these connections were fragile and limited. When sailors returned to their respective ships, they returned to immersing themselves in military cultures that emphasized differences and hierarchies. Personal friendships between Germans and Japanese were exceptions, not the norm. The Axis alliance operated mainly at the level of states and institutions, not at that of individuals. Now then, what legacy did the German-Japanese alliance leave in the relations between the two countries after the war? This is a fascinating question that leads us from history toward the present. After 1945, both Germany and Japan underwent radical transformations. Totalitarian regimes were destroyed, democratic constitutions were imposed by occupying powers, and both countries were integrated into the international order led by the United States. The Axis alliance became a shameful memory that both countries preferred to forget. For decades, post-war German-Japanese relations were cordial but distant. Both countries were allies of the United States, members of the Community of Democratic Nations, important commercial partners. But there existed no special relationship comparable to that which each of them developed with the United States or with other Western partners. The Axis past continued being an uncomfortable theme that both sides preferred to avoid. When German and Japanese diplomats met, they generally focused their conversations on the present and the future, not on the past. The war alliance was like a shameful relative about whom no one wanted to talk at family reunions. However, in recent years there have been some efforts to confront this past in a more direct way. Historians from both countries have collaborated on research projects on the Axis alliance, examining documents and testimonies with the distance that time provides. These studies have produced a more nuanced understanding of the relationship, recognizing both similarities and differences between the two regimes, both the elements of genuine cooperation and the underlying tensions. What lessons do these studies offer for the contemporary world? An important lesson is about the nature of alliances between authoritarian regimes. The Axis alliance demonstrates that such alliances can be superficially impressive but structurally weak, when partners do not share genuine values, when each one primarily pursues its own interests, when mutual distrust undermines effective cooperation. The resulting alliance is less than the sum of its parts. This lesson has relevance for the analysis of alliances between authoritarian regimes in the contemporary world. When we observe countries with similar political systems trying to form blocs against the liberal international order, we can wonder if these alliances will face the same limitations that plague the Axis. Historical evidence suggests the answer is probably yes. Alliances of convenience between regimes that do not share deep values tend to be fragile and ineffective. Another lesson refers to the capacity of ideologies to adapt to political needs. The fiction of honorary Aryans demonstrates how apparently absolute doctrines can be modified when circumstances require it. The Nazis proclaimed Aryan racial superiority as an immutable scientific truth, but when they needed Japanese allies, they suddenly found ways to accommodate this truth to diplomatic needs. This ideological flexibility reveals that doctrines proclaimed by authoritarian regimes are often less genuine principles than power tools adaptable according to circumstances. What would Hitler himself have thought of the reflections we have shared here? Probably he would have furiously rejected any suggestion that his alliance with Japan was contradictory or hypocritical. Hitler was notoriously incapable of recognizing inconsistencies in his own thinking. He believed fervently in his own righteousness and saw any criticism as evidence of his enemy's malice, not of flaws in his logic. But history is not written from the perspective of its protagonists. It is written from the perspective of those who, with the benefit of time and distance, can see what participants could not or did not want to see. And from that perspective, the contradictions in Hitler's relationship with Japan are evident and instructive. Thus, we conclude this segment of our analysis. We have traveled through decades of history, examining classified documents, personal testimonies, official policies, and popular attitudes. We have seen how the alliance between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was simultaneously a real collaboration and a convenient fiction, a union of shared interests and an association plagued with irreconcilable tensions. The question that guided us, whether Hitler admired or despised the Japanese, has received the only answer that evidence permits. Both things at once, in variable proportions according to the context and the moment. This ambivalence was not an accident nor a personal peculiarity of Hitler. It was a necessary consequence of trying to reconcile an extreme racial ideology with the needs of an international policy that required allies from all backgrounds. The lessons of this history continue being relevant. Each time we observe alliances forming between improbable partners, each time we see ideologies adapting to political conveniences, each time we witness the tension between proclaimed principles and real practices, we are seeing echoes of the dynamics we have examined. The story of Hitler in Japan is not just about the past. It is a warning about the ever-present possibilities of institutionalized hypocrisy, of convenient fictions, of alliances that promise more than they can deliver.